Scaphism was one of the most grotesque and inhumane punishments ever conceived by the human mind. Originating in ancient Persia, it was designed not merely to kill, but to break a person completely, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. The condemned was stripped naked and forced into a narrow, hollowed-out log or canoe with another placed over them like a lid, leaving only the head, hands, and feet exposed. Their body was then smeared with milk and honey, which in the blistering sun attracted swarms of insects. The sweetness would seep into their skin, draw flies to their open wounds, and turn their flesh into a rotting, living feast. Scaphism. But the torment didn't stop there. The victim was force-fed more milk and honey until violent diarrhea followed, saturating the enclosed log and turning it into a breeding ground for parasites. The person was left floating in stagnant water, fully conscious as vermin devoured them slowly, crawling into their eyes, nostrils, ears, and even their rectum. They rotted alive, their flesh melting from their bones as they screamed for death that wouldn't come. This wasn't just execution, it was a calculated, drawn-out descent into madness. The process could take days, and with every hour the person felt less human, less alive, less real, until the only thing they knew was pain, infestation, and hopelessness. Scaphism was punishment as theater, designed to horrify those who watched and remind them of the merciless power of the state. The victim didn't just die, they dissolved, slowly, disgustingly, forgotten by mercy, remembered only by the insects. Crucifixion. Crucifixion was not simply a method of execution, it was a public ritual of humiliation, agony, and total domination. Used extensively by the Romans, it was designed to strip a person of every last shred of dignity. The condemned would first be beaten savagely, often with metal-tipped whips that tore flesh from bone. By the time they reached the cross, they were barely recognizable, dragging the very instrument of their own suffering through streets lined with sneering crowds. Blood mixed with dust, bones were exposed, breath already came in choking gas. Then came the nails, not small pins, but crude iron spikes hammered through the wrists and ankles, shattering nerves and locking the body into a state of unbearable pain. Once raised upright, the body sagged forward. Every breath became a calculated struggle. Lift yourself by your nailed limbs to breathe, collapse again from exhaustion, and repeat, over and over, for hours, sometimes for days. But what made crucifixion truly monstrous was its psychological cruelty. It wasn't just about pain, it was about spectacle. Victims were left naked, exposed to the elements, flies, and birds. Passers-by mocked their final moments. There was no comfort, no last words whispered in a lover's ear, only jeers and silence. As the hours dragged on, muscles tore, organs failed, and blood slowly ceased to flow. Death came not as mercy, but as the final theft of breath, of hope, of identity. Crucifixion erased a person from the world in front of that very world's eyes. It wasn't a death, it was a public unraveling of the human soul. Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull was a horrifying fusion of art and atrocity, designed to turn human suffering into a theatrical performance of death. Created in ancient Greece, this execution device was a life-sized hollow bronze bull, meticulously crafted with acoustic tubes in its nostrils and mouth. It was polished, majestic, almost beautiful to look at, but inside it was nothing but a tomb of fire and screaming agony. The condemned would be forced into the belly of the bull, naked and trembling, the heavy metal door sealing shut behind them like the mouth of hell. Then a fire would be lit beneath its belly. Slowly, agonizingly, the bronze would heat, flesh would blister, eyes would boil in their sockets, and skin would fuse with metal. Inside, the person would thrash and scream in blind, instinctive terror, desperate to escape a chamber that turned blood to steam and lungs to ash. But the cruelest detail? The pipes built into the bull's head were engineered to transform the screams into something that sounded like an enraged, bellowing animal. From the outside, it looked like the bull itself was alive, roaring in fury, stomping in rage, shaking with power. People watched, they clapped, they laughed. This wasn't just punishment. It was sadistic performance, a spectacle where death was drawn out into a symphony of agony disguised as sound. When the fire was finally extinguished, all that remained inside was a warped, blackened mass. Melted bone fused to bronze. The bull would be cleaned and polished, ready for its next victim, silent again, until it bellowed once more. Lingchi, or Death by 1,000 Cuts Lingchi, known as Death by 1,000 Cuts, was not just an execution. It was a ritualized annihilation of the human body and soul, used in imperial China for crimes considered especially vile: treason, patricide, sacrilege. It was designed to erase a person from life in slow, shattering fragments. The condemned would be tied to a wooden frame in a public square, stripped of clothing and dignity. Then the executioner, trained for precision, would begin slicing. The first cuts were symbolic, small incisions made on the chest, arms, and legs. These weren't meant to kill, not yet. They were meant to wake every nerve, summon terror, and begin the unraveling. As the crowd watched, more flesh was peeled away, muscles separated from bone, strips of skin hanging like ribbons, soaked in blood. The victim stayed alive, conscious, sometimes for dozens, even hundreds of cuts. They screamed until their throat tore, until their breath was reduced to trembling gas. But Lingchi wasn't merely physical torture, it was spiritual obliteration. In ancient Chinese belief, a mutilated body could not enter the afterlife whole. Lingchi condemned you in life and damned you in death. Some victims were drugged to prolong the suffering. Others were forced to endure it fully aware, as their bodies dissolved piece by piece under the executioner's knife. Each cut was a sentence, each slice a moment of despair. The punishment turned the human body into an object of horror, dissected while still alive. And as the final blow came, usually to the heart, there was no relief, only the knowledge that you had been seen, judged, and carved out of existence, slowly, completely, without mercy. The breaking wheel was a punishment so brutal, so intentionally monstrous, that it turned human bones into splinters and suffering into a public spectacle of pure horror, used across medieval Europe for the most despised criminals, murderers, traitors, robbers. It was not just about death. It was about making the end slow, excruciating, and unforgettable. The condemned would be dragged into a public square, limbs outstretched, body trembling. A massive wooden wheel, often spiked or ridged, loomed nearby. They would be strapped down or laid out on the ground, and then the executioner would begin. With a heavy iron bar, he would swing down on the arms and legs, methodically shattering bones, not in one blow, but multiple calculated strikes designed to break limbs at several points. The victim's body would bend unnaturally, their screams echoing through the watching crowd. Bones snapped like dry twigs, flesh tore, blood pooled. Then came the display. The mutilated body, still alive if the executioner followed the sentence, would be woven through the spokes of the wheel, tied in twisted shapes, and hoisted upright for all to see. There, under the open sky, birds would peck at their eyes, flies would swarm their wounds, and villagers would watch them die over hours or days. This was justice through torment. It wasn't enough to punish the criminal. They had to be destroyed, humiliated, and turned into a warning carved into the collective memory of everyone who witnessed it. The breaking wheel didn't just end lives. It shattered the very structure of the human body, piece by agonizing piece, until nothing remained but twisted limbs and silence. Flaying alive. Flaying alive is one of the most excruciating punishments ever devised, an act so brutal it reduces the human body to raw vulnerability and transforms pain into an unending storm of suffering. This form of execution was used across empires, Assyrians, Persians, medieval rulers, not for justice but for dominance, spectacle, and terror. The victim, often accused of treason or sacrilege, would be bound tightly, stripped of clothes, and exposed to the cold eyes of a gathered crowd. Then the executioner would begin, blade in hand, at the ankles or wrists, cutting through the skin with sickening precision. There was no rush. This was not about speed. It was about agony. The skin was peeled away inch by inch, layer by layer, while the victim remained alive and conscious, every nerve ending screaming in agony as air, dirt, and steel scraped the unprotected flesh. Blood flowed slowly, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to weaken. The face, the chest, the back, nothing was spared. Some were even flayed from head to toe, left entirely skinless, their bodies trembling and shivering in the open air, no longer protected, no longer human. To be flayed alive was to die slowly, with each heartbeat bringing new, unimaginable pain. Some were nailed to walls afterward, their skin hung beside them like a grotesque trophy. Others were left to rot in public squares, a warning in flesh and blood. It was not just execution, it was dehumanization. It was the stripping away of identity, dignity, and soul, leaving behind a screaming, bloodied mass that once was a person. Flaying didn't just kill, it erased, and the screams, long after the voice gave out, echoed in every horrified eye that watched. Rat torture. Rat torture is a punishment so viscerally horrific, it turns the smallest of creatures into instruments of primal terror. It has been used across different cultures and periods, most notoriously during the European Inquisition and under totalitarian regimes. The method is deceptively simple: a live rat, a metal container, and the naked flesh of a human being. The victim would be tied down, often with their abdomen or chest exposed. A rat was placed on their body, and a metal bucket or cage was fixed over it. Then came the fire. The container was gradually heated with burning coals or torches. The rat, frantic from the rising heat, had only one escape: downward. Driven by survival and blind panic, it began to dig, to claw, to bite, into skin, through muscle, toward the warmth of the victim's internal organs. The person beneath it would erupt in screams, not from fear alone, but from the surreal horror of being eaten alive from the outside in, knowing it was a slow creature gnawing through their belly, desperate to survive at their expense. There was no fast death, no shock-induced blackout. It was intimate, incremental torment, felt with every inch the rat burrowed deeper. The shrieks that followed were said to be inhuman, not just because of the pain, but because of what it did to the mind. The helplessness, the knowledge that this wasn't some surgical execution, it was chaos, nature perverted, a helpless animal turned into a tool of agony. This punishment didn't just rip open flesh, it destroyed trust in the laws of nature. It made the victim's body a nest for something primal, dirty, and crawling, a final betrayal of humanity from the inside out. Sawing in half was a punishment born from the depths of cruelty, designed to terrify and torment both victim and witness. Unlike the illusions performed by magicians, this was not a trick. It was a real, methodical execution where the human body was divided slowly, deliberately, while the person was still alive and fully aware of every second. The condemned was suspended upside down, often by the ankles, leaving the blood to rush to their head and keep them conscious for as long as possible. Their legs spread open, they were left vulnerable, exposed, humiliated. The executioners would begin the cut at the groin, where pain is rawest, nerves most sensitive, and the horror most intimate. A thick, serrated blade was dragged back and forth through flesh, muscle, and eventually bone. The sound of the saw grinding through bone filled the air, mingling with the shrieks of agony that could turn even the boldest onlooker pale. The method was slow on purpose. Blood from the lower body flowed upward due to gravity, keeping the brain oxygenated and the victim alive longer than nature would have allowed. This wasn't meant to be swift or merciful. It was meant to send a message, defy the order, and your body becomes the message board. Sometimes the sawing stopped midway, not to spare them, never that, but to let the screams echo a little longer, let the pain deepen, let the audience remember. And then, when breath broke into gurgles, the blade would press forward again, until two pieces remained where one human once stood, until silence returned, until the saw stopped singing. The rack. The rack was the embodiment of controlled agony, an instrument of calculated torment that stretched not only the body, but the very limits of human endurance. Used throughout medieval Europe, especially during inquisitions and witch hunts, it was designed to extract confessions, crush resistance, and unravel the soul through relentless pain. The victim would be laid flat on a wooden frame, wrists and ankles tied to rollers at each end. With each slow, deliberate turn of the handle, the rollers pulled in opposite directions, stretching the body far beyond its natural limits. At first, it felt like a tight pull across the joints. Then, muscles tore, tendons snapped, joints dislocated, the shoulders popped from their sockets with a sickening crunch. The hips followed. The spine began to arch unnaturally as ligaments unraveled under impossible tension. Blood vessels burst under the skin. Bones creaked. Some victims would scream until they passed out. Others, shockingly, stayed conscious, wide-eyed, trembling, broken. But the rack didn't aim to kill quickly. It was meant to keep its victim alive and aware for as long as possible. Executioners were experts in maximizing suffering, tightening the device in slow increments, pausing to let the prisoner breathe, sob, beg. Every twist of the wheel was a demand. Confess, name names, repent, and every refusal brought more pain. Even those who survived never truly escaped. Their bodies remained mangled, limbs dangling uselessly, spines curved grotesquely, muscles permanently torn. They were left not just punished, but reshaped, living warnings to anyone who dared defy the system. The rack didn't just torment the body, it rewrote it into a monument of fear. Impalement was not a punishment meant to kill swiftly. It was designed to horrify, to make the condemned suffer in ways that blurred the line between life and death. It is remembered most infamously through the actions of Vlad, the Impaler, but this method was used across centuries and continents, always with the same chilling goal: turn the human body into a monument of agony. The condemned would be stripped naked, their limbs bound tightly, and a sharpened wooden or metal stake would be driven into their body, often through the rectum or vagina, carefully angled to avoid immediate death. The cruelty lay in the precision. The stake would be greased and inserted slowly, inch by inch, through soft tissue, muscle, organs. Executioners were skilled in avoiding major arteries, ensuring the person would not die too quickly. The body would convulse in helpless spasms as the pole pierced upwards, through the torso, the chest, sometimes emerging through the mouth, the shoulder, or even the neck. The victim remained alive, pinned like a butterfly, screaming in silent terror as the stake became part of them, holding their weight, elevating their suffering. Impalement could last for hours, days. The body would sag as gravity pulled it downward, dragging torn flesh over splintered wood. Insects gathered, birds circled, spectators watched. This wasn't death, it was display, a message carved in blood and agony. Disobey, and this is your fate. Even after death, the body would remain, bloated, rotting, a frozen scream on its face, the stake standing tall like a pillar of pain. Impalement did not kill a man. It shattered him, publicly, irreversibly, and with terrifying precision. Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is a punishment that whispers promises of safety before unleashing a symphony of blood. At first glance, it resembles a towering sarcophagus, tall, regal, almost like a statue. It stands with arms open, inviting, with a faint metallic grin. But inside, its true nature lurks, a forest of sharpened iron spikes lining the interior, positioned with meticulous cruelty to pierce not vital organs at once, but the flesh, the ribs, the eyes, the limbs, just enough to keep you alive, just enough to make sure you feel everything. The victim would be forced to stand inside, often trembling, screaming, pleading. Then the door would close, slowly, mechanically, until the spikes kissed the skin. They didn't kill outright. That would be mercy. Instead, they slid between bones, grazed organs, punctured lungs without collapsing them, pierced thighs without severing arteries. The pain wasn't a flash. It was a blooming flower of agony, unfolding petal by petal in the darkness of the steel tomb. Inside, there was no room to move. Any motion drove the spikes deeper. Panic meant pain. Breathing meant bleeding. The screams were muffled by layers of iron, and death came not from the wound, but from infection, dehydration, or madness. Some suffered for hours, others for days. The Iron Maiden was rarely just about execution. It was about spectacle. It stood in dungeons not to be used often, but to terrify eternally. It was death behind a door, silent and ceremonial, and those who saw it knew. Once it closed, nothing human came out. Only silence, only blood, only memory. Boiling alive was not punishment. It was pure sadism set to a slow, hissing rhythm. Used across cultures, from medieval Europe to feudal Asia, this method was a brutal theater of heat, flesh, and despair. The condemned was often stripped completely, their body trembling not from cold, but from the terrifying knowledge of what was to come. They were dragged toward a massive cauldron filled with oil, water, pitch, molten lead, or even wine. Sometimes they were tied into a metal cage and lowered gradually. Other times they were thrown in all at once, their skin scalding in seconds. If the liquid wasn't already boiling, it was brought to a boil with the body inside. This made the death even more monstrous. The person would feel the slow rise of temperature, first warmth, then stinging pain, then indescribable torment as blisters erupted, flesh melted, and muscle tore away from bone. Screams pierced the air, mingled with the bubbling hiss of liquid cooking human tissue. Eyes boiled in their sockets, lips sloughed off the face, skin floated in the pot like meat being prepared for a feast. Spectators gathered to watch. This was punishment as spectacle, justice served in fire. For certain crimes, poisoning, treason, heresy, authorities believed the agony had to match the sin. The condemned didn't die quickly. They suffered, they begged, and as their body dissolved into something unrecognizable, the message was made brutally clear. Betrayal meant obliteration. The pot would be emptied, cleaned, filled again, and next time someone else would scream, skin searing as the punishment repeated, merciless, unforgettable, and slow. Stoning is not a swift execution. It is the art of death by collective judgment, slow, brutal, and deeply psychological. Unlike other punishments delivered by the hand of one executioner, stoning demands a crowd. It demands participation. The condemned is led into an open space, often blindfolded, sometimes half buried in the earth, left exposed and helpless. There is no blade, no fire, just stones, gathered by family, neighbors, elders, and silence before the storm of violence begins. The first stone rarely kills, nor the second. They land with dull thuds against bone and flesh, splitting skin, shattering fingers as the condemned tries to shield their face. Blood trickles, then pours. Bones crack beneath the growing weight of rage, shame, or duty from the mob. There is no precision, no mercy. The victim is broken in pieces, one jagged, merciless impact at a time. The face swells beyond recognition. The rib cage caves. Teeth scatter like gravel. What makes stoning uniquely monstrous is its intimacy. It requires effort. It forces people to watch, to choose, to throw. Sometimes the first stones are tossed hesitantly, but once the first strike lands, something unholy stirs in the crowd. Children follow their fathers. Friends obey their leaders. A rhythm builds, not of justice, but of frenzy. The condemned dies beneath a chorus of hands, crushed by judgment and buried under the very instruments of their suffering. Stoning is not just punishment, it is erasure by community, a declaration that someone is no longer worthy of breath. And by the time the stones settle, the silence left behind is heavier than the body beneath them. Hung, drawn, and quartered. To be hung, drawn, and quartered was to be subjected to a punishment so savage, so calculated in its horror, that it became the most feared sentence in medieval England, reserved for men convicted of high treason. It was not merely death, it was a ceremonial obliteration of body, identity, and honor. The condemned would first be tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the filthy streets by horse, jeered and spit upon by the public. This was not transport, it was degradation, the beginning of a journey into living hell. Once at the execution site, they were hanged by the neck, but not to die. No, the rope was cut just before unconsciousness took them, reviving them in gasping, flailing agony. Their body would be weak, their mind unraveling, and yet the worst had not even begun. They were then stripped naked and laid bare before the crowd. The executioner would take a knife and slice open the abdomen, exposing the intestines, then slowly pulling them out while the victim was still breathing. The entrails would be burned before their eyes. The genitals were often hacked off and tossed aside like garbage. Still alive, screaming, bleeding, broken, they were made to watch the desecration of their own form. Finally, mercy came with beheading, or what passed for it. The lifeless remains were then quartered, arms and legs hacked off, and sent to the corners of the kingdom as a warning. Heads were spiked on gates, eyes still frozen in terror. This was not punishment. It was a theater of torment, a ritual of pain performed for a bloodthirsty crowd, a declaration that betrayal would not be punished with death, but with total, unforgettable destruction. Spanish tickler, or cat's paw. The Spanish tickler, often called the cat's paw, was a tool forged not for killing quickly, but for unmaking the human body in the most deliberate, degrading way imaginable. It looked almost innocent at first, small, claw-like, with curved metal fingers sharpened to points, but in the hands of torturers, it became a symphony of mutilation. Victims, often bound naked to walls or wooden posts, would be at the complete mercy of its cold embrace. The claws would dig into their skin, not to slice cleanly, but to rip, tear, and shred. Flesh came away in chunks. Strips of muscle were peeled from the bone. The torturer didn't rush. Each motion was a slow rake, a gentle pull, a deliberate flaying. It was often used on the limbs, back, chest, and sometimes the face, tearing away identity along with tissue. But the most horrifying part wasn't just the pain, it was the sound. The wet, tearing sound of skin being dragged from living muscle, the choking screams that followed, the gasping, pleading, the sheer disbelief that such agony could be drawn out for so long. Sometimes the cat's paw was heated, making the claws sear into the body as they tore it apart. Victims didn't die quickly. They bled, they sobbed, they begged for death that wouldn't come, and if they passed out, they were revived, not for mercy, but to begin again. This wasn't punishment, it was destruction. The Spanish tickler didn't just hurt, it erased. It turned humans into meat, into lessons, into warnings, etched into the memory of every bystander who watched and never forgot. Thumbscrews. Thumbscrews were a small device with unimaginable consequences, an instrument of torture that didn't kill the body, but crushed the mind. Used across medieval Europe during interrogations, witch hunts, and inquisitions, they were simple in design, yet devastating in effect. The victim's fingers or thumbs were placed between iron bars, and then the screws were slowly turned, tightening the metal jaws until bones cracked like dry twigs under pressure. It began with pressure, an unbearable squeezing that quickly escalated into searing pain. As the screws turned, flesh burst open, fingernails split or tore away, and joints shattered one by one. The torment was precise, localized, intimate. Unlike more theatrical tortures, thumb screws were designed to be used face to face. The torturer could watch every twitch, every scream, every ounce of defiance breaking into sobs as the victim begged for the pain to stop. This wasn't punishment meant for death. It was for information, for confessions, for extracting truths or fabrications from people desperate to make it end. And it worked. People confessed to crimes they hadn't committed. Witches named neighbors. Heretics renounced their beliefs. The agony was so sharp, so consuming, that reality itself unraveled under the pressure. Sometimes the screws were used on toes, sometimes heated first, and often, after one hand was crushed, they'd start on the other. The horror of thumb screws wasn't in the blood, it was in the silence that followed, when the scream stopped, not because the pain ended, but because the will was broken. That's what thumb screws were built to do, not kill, break, quietly, completely. Pillory and public whipping. Pillory and public whipping was a punishment that didn't just hurt, it humiliated. It wasn't about removing a person from society. It was about exposing them to it, naked and vulnerable, as an object of ridicule, rage, and pain. The pillory was a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, locking the victim in place in a standing bow of forced submission. They stood in the center of a square, a market, or a churchyard, with their face immobilized, their body defenseless, and their dignity left behind. Then came the whipping. Stripped to the waist, the victim's back became a canvas of red. Leather lashes tore across the skin with sharp, rhythmic violence, each crack echoing through the crowd. Blood spattered, flesh split, and the air thickened with the scent of sweat, iron, and salt. But the real cruelty wasn't the whip alone. It was the crowd. People gathered not just to witness, but to participate. They hurled insults, rotted food, stones, excrement, laughed, spat, some threw with rage, others with joy. Children watched, mothers pointed. The victim became a lesson taught through agony. This is what happens when you disobey. This is what shame looks like. And even when the whipping stopped, the punishment wasn't over. The pillory could hold you there for hours, sometimes days, through rain, sun, cold, cramped muscles seized, eyes burned from sweat and filth. You couldn't wipe your face. You couldn't beg. You could only endure, locked into stillness, while time and humiliation dragged you across the edge of despair. Public whipping and the pillory didn't just scar skin. They broke pride. They shattered identity. They made pain a performance, and the audience complicit in every lash. Cropping, or cutting off ears. Cropping was a punishment that bled humiliation more than blood, though there was always plenty of both. In early modern Europe and colonial America, this brutal sentence was inflicted on those accused of slander, theft, sedition, or simply falling afoul of power. It was deceptively simple in design. The condemned would be shackled in a public square, bound to a post or pillory, and their ears, symbols of identity, dignity, and humanity, would be sliced off with a blade or shears, cleanly or crudely, depending on the executioner's skill or mood. It wasn't just pain, it was the sound, the tearing, the gurgle of blood, the scream torn from a throat too dry to carry it. The ears weren't always removed in one motion. Sometimes it was done in slivers, prolonging the agony, making the blood run slower, warmer. The wound, left open, was rarely treated. Flies landed, infections festered, but the horror went deeper than the body. Cropping marked you as an outsider forever. No matter what clothes you wore, how you spoke, or how you changed, your absence would always speak louder than your presence. Some had their ears nailed to a post before being cut, forced to stand in agonizing stillness until they either tore free on their own or fainted from the pain. The crowd would laugh. Children would point. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about branding shame directly into the body. You didn't serve your time and return to life. You lived marked, disfigured, othered. Cropping wasn't about justice. It was a performance of power, a reminder, carved in blood and silence, that some wounds never stop screaming, tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering was not designed to kill the body. It was crafted to destroy the soul, a punishment born from mob rage and public humiliation. It was a spectacle meant to shred identity, strip dignity, and brand a person with shame that lingered far beyond pain. The process began with forced restraint, often by a furious crowd. The victim, terrified and pleading, would be held down or tied to a post as hot tar, boiling black and bubbling, was poured or brushed across their bare skin. The tar scalded instantly. It burned through clothes, through pores, through any hope of escape. It didn't need knives. The liquid itself was the blade. Victims screamed, not from a single wound, but from the sudden full-body eruption of agony. Skin blistered, eyes swelled shut. Every breath became a cry. Then, while the tar still sizzled, feathers were dumped onto the body, soft, innocent feathers that clung like a mockery, turning the victim into a grotesque caricature of a human being. But the worst part wasn't the burning or the itching that followed. It was the parade. Victims were often forced to march through towns, displayed like broken trophies, laughed at by neighbors, children, strangers. They were spat on, mocked, called traitor, coward, scum, and they carried that image forever. Removing the tar was another nightmare, scraped off with knives, with skin, with blood. Infection followed, scars remained, and even if the body survived, something else died: respect, community, the sense of self. Tarring and feathering wasn't just punishment. It was erasure in broad daylight, a fire lit, not with matches, but with public hate. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a device shaped like a fruit, but crafted with the darkest intentions, to tear apart the body from within, silently, cruelly, and without leaving a single external mark. Made of metal, it featured petal-like segments that opened outward when a screw at its base was turned. It was inserted into the victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the accusation. Blasphemers had it forced down their throats. Adulterers, women accused of witchcraft, or sodomites had it used on their most intimate parts. There was no escape. At first, the cold steel sat still, and the victim trembled in anticipation. Then the turning began. Slowly, deliberately, the torturer twisted the screw, and the petals began to bloom, not like a flower, but like a trap. Flesh tore, muscle ruptured, internal cavities were split apart. The pressure was unbearable, the pain unique and deep, like something unnatural blooming inside of you, turning your own body into a weapon against itself. What made the pear so horrifying was its quietness. It didn't scream, it didn't bleed, it broke people from the inside out, often in front of silent rooms where the victim's eyes were the only things left that could plead. Death didn't always come immediately. Sometimes they survived, broken, bleeding internally, unable to speak, unable to walk, unable to forget. The Pear of Anguish wasn't designed to end life. It was built to end identity, to rob a person of control, voice, and self. It was the weapon of those who didn't just want to punish. They wanted to hollow you from the inside and leave nothing human behind. The Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle was a device built not just to torture the body, but to violate the very core of a person's humanity. Used during the dark days of the Inquisition and in secret chambers across medieval Europe, this grotesque punishment weaponized gravity, shame, and flesh all at once. The condemned would be stripped naked, bound with ropes, and hoisted above a strange pyramid-shaped wooden structure, its tip sharp, smooth, cold. Their legs would be tied apart, and slowly, agonizingly, they would be lowered. The point of the cradle was not designed to pierce, not at first. It was designed to enter, inch by inch, into the rectum or vagina. The body trembled with instinctive terror as muscles clenched, as dignity dissolved. Every breath became a silent scream, and when they reached the point where their own weight pressed them fully downward, the real horror began. The spike would tear muscle, stretch tissue, rupture organs, but never cleanly, slowly, jaggedly. Sometimes the torment was prolonged by lifting the victim back up and lowering them again, over and over, so the pain would never numb. The wood, stained with blood and waste, was rarely cleaned. Infection, delirium, and sepsis followed. But before death came shame, utter, unbearable shame. Witnesses were sometimes invited. Laughter echoed in the background. The victim's screams blurred into the sounds of rope and wood. The Judas Cradle wasn't about punishment. It was about invasion, about reducing a soul to something so broken, so defiled, that even in death they would never be whole again. It made the body the weapon and turned pain into possession. Heretic's Fork. The Heretic's Fork was a device so small, so seemingly simple, yet it delivered a punishment that was as psychological as it was physical. Used during the Inquisition and other religious persecutions, it was crafted not to kill, but to torment, to hold a person in a frozen prison of agony and terror, one breath at a time. The device itself was a metal rod with sharp prongs on both ends, one side pressing under the chin, the other into the sternum or the throat. It was strapped tightly around the neck with leather, forcing the victim into absolute stillness. You could not speak. You could not look down. You could not sleep. Any attempt to rest your head, to collapse from exhaustion, to cry out in pain or prayer, would drive the sharpened forks into your flesh, piercing skin, drawing blood, keeping you on the edge of pain, but never letting you fall into the mercy of unconsciousness. Days would pass in silence. The body trembled, the muscles ached, the neck locked upright as the victim's mind unraveled. But the true horror was isolation. Often, the fork was used in dark cells, where the only sound was your ragged breath and the dull echo of your heartbeat. The constant knowledge that any movement would result in stabbing pain created a creeping paranoia, a slow erosion of sanity. You were turned into your own executioner. Every twitch, every flinch, a self-inflicted wound. There was no audience, no screaming crowd, just a man or woman, nailed into stillness, abandoned with their thoughts and their sins. The Heretic's Fork didn't just punish the body, it crucified the soul, inch by inch, hour by hour, until the silence became more torturous than the blades themselves. Scold's Bridle. The Scold's Bridle was not a punishment of blood and blades. It was one of silence, control, and humiliation, forged specifically to break women in the most dehumanizing way possible. Also known as the brank, it was a cage of iron that enclosed the head like a grotesque helmet. With hinges and clamps, it was locked around the skull, often with ornamental cruelty, horns, spikes, or grotesque masks to intensify the shame. But inside, hidden from view, was its most vicious feature, a sharp iron plate or spike designed to press into the tongue or sometimes pierce it entirely. The device was used on women labeled scolds, a word that barely masked the real offense, speaking too freely, too sharply, too often. Wives who argued, women who gossiped, rebels who questioned male authority. Once fitted, the bridle made speech impossible. Any attempt to talk forced the tongue into the spike, slicing it open or pinning it like meat on a hook. The pain was instant, but the purpose was deeper, to extinguish voice, erase identity, and turn women into quiet, compliant shadows. The victim was often paraded through the streets like livestock, tethered with a chain, while townspeople jeered and spat. Children laughed. Men watched, and behind the iron mask, the woman's tears pooled where no one could see them. She could not scream. She could not plead. She could only bleed in silence. The Scold's bridle didn't kill. It didn't need to. It stole what made someone human, the right to speak, to protest, to be heard. It turned women into warnings, their pain muffled beneath metal, their punishment a brutal lesson etched into silence. Pressing to death, known formally as peine forte et dure, was a punishment that took the very weight of the world and used it to crush a human soul. It was most infamously used in England and colonial America for those who refused to plead in court, often in witch trials, or for accused traitors. The condemned would be stripped and laid flat on their back, shackled to a wooden board. Then came the stones. One by one, heavy slabs of rock or iron were placed on the victim's chest. At first, it forced the breath out of their lungs. Then it shattered the ribs. Then it slowly, methodically crushed the organs beneath. But the executioners didn't hurry. They were deliberate. After each stone, they'd ask, "Do you plead?" And the victim, often defiant, would whisper no, because pleading meant a corrupt court could steal your land, your family's inheritance, your name. Refusing kept your legacy intact, but at an unthinkable price. The agony was total. Breathing turned to choking. Blood vessels burst. Bones snapped under the weight. Eyes bulged. The heart was flattened like paper. But the cruelest part was time. Pressing didn't kill instantly. It murdered in minutes or even hours, letting the victim feel every inch of their body betray them, every heartbeat slow under the crushing silence. In the end, it wasn't just the stones that killed. It was the choice. Speak and be condemned. Stay silent and be crushed. And when the final stone fell, what died wasn't just a body, but the last breath of defiance in a world that demanded submission. Nailing the tongue. Nailing the tongue was a punishment that silenced more than speech. It extinguished defiance, expression, and the very essence of identity, reserved for blasphemers, liars, heretics, and those who dared speak against kings, clergy, or law. This brutal act took the most human part of communication and turned it into a site of agony. The condemned would be dragged into a public square, beaten, sometimes gagged to stop them from biting through their own tongue before punishment could begin. Then came the iron spike, long, rusted, unrelenting. Their mouth was forced open, wide and trembling, the tongue swollen with terror, blood, and the memory of every word spoken was yanked forward with iron tongs, and then, in front of jeering crowds or silent onlookers, it was nailed, hammered through into a wooden board or the pillory itself. One violent blow, and flesh met iron, blood burst across the wood, and a scream erupted that no longer resembled language. They were left like that for hours, sometimes days, standing or bound, forced to feel every movement of their head, every twitch of the neck, as a fresh spike of torment ran through their face. Flies gathered, the wound festered, blood pooled down the chin, mixing with tears and spit. The taste of iron never left their mouth, and when the nail was finally removed, if it ever was, the tongue would be shredded, mangled, often useless forever. This punishment didn't just silence dissent, it mutilated it. It made a lesson out of the mouth, a warning that speech, in the wrong hands, could cost more than life. It could cost the ability to ever speak again. Dunking stool. The dunking stool was not designed to kill, but to humiliate, to degrade, and to drown a person's soul in fear and shame. Used primarily on women accused of witchcraft, gossip, or defiance, this punishment turned public scorn into a weapon of torture. The condemned was tied to a wooden chair fastened to a long beam, perched over a filthy river or stagnant pond, while jeering crowds gathered to watch the spectacle. There was no trial here, no justice, just a punishment performed for laughter, for control, for dominance disguised as moral order. Once secured, the woman was lowered into the icy water. The shock of it slammed into her chest. and she kicked violently against her bonds, struggling to breathe as murky water filled her nose, her ears, her lungs. She would be pulled up again, gasping, coughing, choking, only to be plunged back in, again and again. Sometimes it lasted minutes, sometimes hours. The cold stole the breath, the rope bruised the skin, the crowd never looked away. Each dunk was another crack in the mind. It wasn't just the water, it was the laughter, the pointing, the certainty that you were powerless, that your suffering was sport. In many cases, the punishment was fatal, not from drowning, but from pneumonia, hypothermia, or the collapse of the will. Women emerged broken, soaked not just in water, but in disgrace, their bodies trembling, their reputations shattered. The dunking stool was cruelty masked as correction. It taught that silence was safer than defiance, that survival came only through submission, and for those who lived through it, the memory of sinking, not just into water but into public hatred, would never rise to the surface again. Iron collar torture. The iron collar was a punishment that didn't spill blood immediately. It chose instead to choke, to crush, and to keep its victim in a state of constant, paralyzing torment. Forged from cold, unyielding metal, the collar was fastened tightly around the neck, sometimes spiked from the inside or outside, sometimes attached to chains that tethered the person to a wall like an animal. It didn't scream for attention like whips or flames. It whispered its cruelty, hour after hour, day after day, until the body surrendered and the mind fractured. Worn too tightly, it cut into the throat and jaw, making swallowing an ordeal and breathing a conscious act. Worn long enough, the edges would rub raw against flesh, opening wounds that refused to heal. In some designs, inward-facing spikes pressed into the skin so that the smallest movement, an instinctive turn of the head or slump from exhaustion, would drive pain deep into nerve and bone. Sleep became impossible. Hunger became irrelevant. The only focus was the ache, the constant grinding, choking ache. Victims would be forced to live in these collars for days, weeks, sometimes months. The collar didn't just restrain, it degraded. People were left to soil themselves, kneel in corners, crawl for food, while the collar reminded them of their place with every breath they took. It was especially used for slaves, prisoners, and rebels, those deemed lesser, silence without a word. There was no heroic struggle, no quick death, just a tightening loop of suffering, just metal against flesh, cold and merciless, turning time itself into torture, a slow, suffocating erosion of dignity, one heartbeat at a time. Hanging in cages. Hanging in cages was a punishment meant not only to end life, but to erase it in full view of the world. The victim was locked into a human-sized iron cage, sometimes fitted tightly to prevent even the smallest movements, and then hoisted high into the air or suspended from the walls of castles, gallows, or city gates. There, in plain sight of all who passed, they were left, not for hours, not for days, but for as long as it took the body to surrender, first to thirst, then to madness, then to death. There was no escape, no shade from the sun, no protection from the rain, no peace in the darkness. Birds would land on them, pick at their eyes. Rats would gather beneath the cage, drawn to the fluids dripping from blistered feet. Insects swarmed, crawling into open wounds, laying eggs in the flesh. The victim, still alive, would scream for mercy until their voice cracked, their throat swelled, and their mind fractured under the weight of isolation and rot. Sometimes they were left to starve, sometimes they were wounded first, so death would take longer, and when death finally came, it was not the end. The body remained in that cage, decomposing slowly in public view, bones showing through sloughing skin, hollow eyes watching travelers and children pass by. It was a message in flesh: defy the law, and your corpse will preach obedience long after your soul has fled. This punishment wasn't just execution, it was exposure, humiliation, a death that kept speaking long after the last breath had vanished into the sky. Execution by elephants. Execution by elephants was a punishment that blurred the line between spectacle and savagery, justice and terror. Practiced in South and Southeast Asia for centuries, especially under royal command, it was a method reserved for traitors, rebels, and those considered a threat to the throne. Elephants, symbols of divine power and imperial might, were trained not just to kill, but to torture. These weren't wild beasts acting on instinct. They were instruments of deliberate, methodical death. The condemned would be brought before a crowd, shackled and trembling beneath the towering weight of a war elephant. The executioner didn't wield a blade. He gave commands, and the elephant obeyed. Sometimes the victim was flung through the air, crushed beneath a foot, or dragged through the dust by a tusk. But often, the process was slower. The elephant would place its massive foot on the victim's limbs, one at a time, applying just enough pressure to snap bones while keeping them alive. Arms, legs, ribs, skull last. In other cases, sharpened blades were fitted to the tusks, turning the elephant into a living execution machine. The animal would slice, gore, trample, while the crowd watched in awe and fear. Sometimes the condemned would be tied to the ground, forced to stare upward as the creature loomed above, its foot descending inch by inch, the weight of death slowly suffocating them in silence. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a statement, a display of unstoppable power. To be killed by an elephant wasn't just to die, it was to be crushed by something sacred, something greater than man, and in that moment, pain wasn't the end, it was the message. Molten gold poured down the throat. Molten gold poured down the throat is a punishment that defies belief, gruesome, theatrical, and drenched in the irony of wealth as weapon. It was used to execute those consumed by greed, corrupt officials, traitors, or enemy leaders who hoarded riches at the expense of others. The condemned would be captured, stripped, bound, and forced to their knees, mouth pried open wide with iron tongs or wooden blocks. There would be no explanation, no plea, only the hiss of metal melting over fire, glowing white-hot in a crucible nearby as death waited like a shadow. Then the gold would be lifted, shimmering, alive with heat, and with no ceremony it would be poured straight into the mouth, down the throat, into the core of the body. The moment it touched flesh, it seared through everything, lips, tongue, esophagus, fusing organs in a split second of blinding, unbearable pain. The scream would never come. The vocal cords would cauterize before a sound could escape. Steam and blood burst from the nose and eyes. The body convulsed, violently, grotesquely, before collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. But it wasn't just a way to kill, it was a message, a final, mocking punishment that turned the very thing a person lusted after into the agent of their destruction. Their corpse, sometimes opened for display, revealed gilded entrails, organs coated in gold, a grim sculpture of vanity and excess. Molten gold down the throat was the ultimate irony, a death forged by desire, where wealth became fire and greed melted a man from the inside out. Castration. Castration is not merely the removal of flesh, it is the violent erasure of identity, power, and humanity. Across empires and centuries, it was used as a tool not just to punish, but to permanently redefine a man's existence. The procedure could be surgical or savage. At times, the genitals were tied tightly to cut off blood flow, then sliced away with a knife, a shard of glass, or a burning blade. In other cases, they were crushed between stones or torn off with brutal force, leaving the victim in a puddle of blood, breathless from shock, writhing in unspeakable pain. But it wasn't only the searing, nerve-deep agony that made castration so monstrous. It was what came after, the mutilation of masculinity. Castrated men, often called eunuchs, were left to live in altered bodies, stripped of their ability to reproduce, to feel desire as they once did, or to carry the voice and appearance that marked them as male. In some cases, they were kept alive as servants, singers, or slaves, empty shadows of their former selves, praised for obedience, mocked for their absence. In many cultures, it was inflicted not for crimes, but to punish defiance, to humiliate rivals, to control populations. It was inflicted on boys, on prisoners, on lovers accused of disloyalty, and behind every act was the same message: you are no longer whole, you are no longer man. The wounds festered, the body weakened, the soul withered, and whether it was done with ceremony or in the dirt, castration didn't just punish, it stole. It marked a person forever, turning a life into a sentence without end. Tongue removal. Tongue removal was a punishment that didn't just silence the voice, it annihilated it. Reserved for blasphemers, political dissidents, outspoken women, and anyone who dared to speak truth against power, it was one of the most personal, intimate forms of mutilation. The tongue is not just a muscle, it's identity. It's how we plead, confess, cry out, sing, beg. To have it ripped from your mouth wasn't simply to be punished, it was to be erased. The procedure itself was barbaric. The victim was bound, head clamped in a vise to keep it still, jaw pried open. Hooks or tongs were forced into the mouth to seize the tongue, pulling it out as far as it could stretch. And then, without anesthetic, without mercy, the blade came down. Sometimes it was sliced, sometimes torn. The result was always the same: gushing blood, gasping screams that turned into gurgles, the body writhing as the symbol of their voice hit the floor like meat. But it didn't end there. The wound festered. Speaking became a lifetime of agony. Eating turned into torture. The mouth filled with infection. The person lived, but lived broken, humiliated, unable to defend themselves, forever silenced in the most literal way. The horror of tongue removal wasn't just physical, it was existential. It told you your words have power, and we will tear that power from your flesh. It was a punishment that reached into the core of what it means to be human, not to bleed, not to die, but to be silenced permanently, brutally, and completely. Nose or ear amputation. Nose or ear amputation was a punishment not designed to kill, but to brand, to carve shame into the body so deeply that it followed the victim long after the bleeding stopped. Practiced across ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to medieval Europe, this form of mutilation was used on thieves, adulterers, runaway slaves, and those who defied power. It was the cruel precision of the act that made it so devastating. Not the loss of life, but the loss of face. The condemned would be restrained, usually in public, surrounded by onlookers whose eyes burned with judgment or curiosity. There was no anesthesia, no comfort, just a knife, hot iron, or blade, and the final moment of stillness before flesh met steel. The ear was sliced clean or ragged, torn from the skull in one brutal motion. The nose, sometimes slit down the middle, other times hacked entirely off, left the victim screaming through rivers of blood that poured down their face and neck. But the wound was only part of the punishment. The real sentence came afterward, when they walked through the streets marked, exposed, deformed. Strangers would turn away, children would point, employers would reject, lovers would retreat. The absence of a nose or ear became a permanent confession carved into skin. I sinned, I failed, I was owned. These mutilations silenced people without binding them, punished them without imprisonment, erased them from honor while leaving them alive. And every glance, every whisper, every mirror became a weapon, reminding them day after day that their body now told a story they could never take back. Siberian Exile. Siberian exile was a punishment that didn't rely on blades or flames. It relied on time, frost, and forgetting. Used widely under Tsarist Russia and later the Soviet regime, it was the slow execution of a person's existence through isolation, deprivation, and a death stretched across endless, frozen years. The condemned, whether political dissidents, peasants, writers, or so-called enemies of the state, were seized from their homes, often at night with no warning, Families were torn apart in seconds, possessions left behind, identities stripped like coats at the door. They were marched through blizzards and rain to waiting trains, packed into freezing cattle cars, with no heat, no food, and barely any light. The journey alone killed many, but for those who survived, arrival in Siberia was not a new beginning. It was a death sentence disguised as relocation. They were dropped in remote labor camps, surrounded by endless forests, snow-covered wastelands, and silence so thick it pressed on the lungs. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. Frostbite came in hours, hunger in days, madness in months. They chopped trees until their fingers bled, built roads until their backs broke, mined rock until their lungs filled with dust. The guards barely spoke. Letters were lost or censored. Names were forgotten. Years passed in gray repetition, in cold that wrapped around the bones like iron. There were no screams, just coughing, silence, and the occasional gunshot echoing across the tundra. Siberian exile didn't just kill people, it erased them. It turned them into ghosts long before death arrived, forgotten by the world, buried not in soil, but in snow, history, and silence. Burning at the stake. Burning at the stake was not simply execution. It was spectacle by fire, a public annihilation designed to terrify the soul as much as it destroyed the body. It was most famously used during witch hunts, inquisitions, and religious purges, where the accused, often women, heretics, or rebels, were condemned not just to die, but to be purified by flame. The victim was dragged through the streets, jeered at by crowds who saw them not as people, but as warnings. Their hands were bound, their clothes torn, and they were tied upright to a wooden post, surrounded by dry kindling, soaked in oil or fat. The fire was not always lit quickly. Sometimes it was delayed, so the victim could listen to the priest read a final sermon, a final chance for repentance, knowing that nothing could stop the burning. When the flames finally reached them, it was not a sudden engulfment, but a rising wall of heat that licked at the feet, then the legs, and then the belly. Skin blistered, eyes melted, the mouth opened in a scream that was ripped apart by smoke. The body twisted, convulsed, fought the bindings with desperate strength, and through it all, the crowd watched. Some wept, others cheered. The fire turned flesh to ash, lungs to charcoal, hope to dust. It was a death designed to erase not only life, but reputation, framed as justice, divinely sanctioned, eternal. But for the one bound to the stake, there was no redemption, only pain, only fire, only the knowledge that their death was a message carved into flame, and their ashes would blow away with the same wind that carried their screams. Water torture is deceptively simple because it uses the most vital, innocent substance on earth to drive a person into madness. There are many forms, each more insidious than the last, but they all share one thing: turning the gift of life into a weapon of psychological ruin. The most infamous is the slow drip, cold, relentless drops falling onto a victim's forehead in perfect intervals, again and again, for hours, for days, until the mind can no longer distinguish one drop from the next, until time ceases to exist, and all that remains is the waiting, the twitching, the collapse. Another method forced victims to lie on a board, their heads lower than their feet, as gallons of water were poured through a rag stuffed in their mouths. The gag sealed their throats, making it impossible to swallow or breathe. The body panicked, the lungs screamed, and the brain was flooded with the instinctive terror of drowning. Again and again, water filled the sinuses, poured into the stomach, choked the throat. Every second was a death. Every gasp was a betrayal of hope. But water torture wasn't designed to kill. That was never the point. Its genius, its cruelty, was in creating the sensation of death without delivering it, to drown the soul while keeping the body alive, to suffocate the mind while the heart kept beating. There are no visible scars from water torture, but the ones it leaves on sanity, on memory, on trust in the safety of breath, never fade. It is death, fractioned out in droplets. It is fear, liquefied, and it drowns a person from the inside out. Bamboo torture. Bamboo torture was a punishment whispered more often than witnessed because its cruelty didn't scream. It crept, it waited, it grew. Used in parts of East and Southeast Asia, this form of torture weaponized nature itself, turning a harmless plant into a silent executioner. The process began with the condemned bound tightly over a patch of freshly cut, young bamboo shoots. The victim's back, legs, or even torso would be fixed in place, immobilized, exposed, and helpless, while beneath them, green stalks reached upward like waiting fingers. Then, time took over. Bamboo grows rapidly, some species up to 1 inch an hour, and its shoots, thin as they may begin, are razor-sharp at the tip and relentless in their ascent. Slowly, over hours, then days, the stalks would pierce the skin. First, a sting, then a burn, then a horrifying pressure as the shoots pushed deeper, splitting muscle, threading through sinew, seeking light through the tunnels of the human body. The person remained alive as the bamboo impaled them from below, slowly burrowing upward, through the back, the chest, the throat, leaving no room to scream, only to exist inside growing green agony. What made bamboo torture so monstrous was its silence. No hammers, no chains, just the sound of rustling leaves, creaking wood, shallow breath, and the soft, wet sound of skin parting. Death didn't arrive as a moment. It unfolded like a nightmare, calm, steady, unstoppable. This wasn't violence by man. It was patience weaponized, nature twisted into cruelty. And when death finally came, it was not by blade, but by the gentle, merciless insistence of growth. Keelhauling. Keelhauling was a punishment born of the sea, a savage ritual that turned the ocean itself into a weapon and the ship into an instrument of torture. Practiced by naval forces and pirates alike, it was reserved for the most hated offenses: insubordination, theft, cowardice. The condemned sailor was stripped, bound with ropes, and dragged beneath the ship's keel from one side to the other, scraping against the barnacle-covered hull, blind beneath the waves, lungs screaming for air. The first moment was panic, water flooding the mouth, darkness swallowing the eyes. Then came the pain. The ship's underside, crusted with razor-sharp shells and marine growth, tore through flesh like shattered glass. Skin peeled away in sheets. Salt water rushed into open wounds. The rope burned across the limbs as the body twisted and bled. If the man was lucky, he surfaced half-drowned and mutilated. If not, he emerged dead, or not at all. There was no mercy in the water, no reprieve from the coral teeth or the ocean's crushing silence. The crew stood watching, their eyes cold, their silence deafening. Sometimes the victim was keel-hauled, multiple times, each pass shredding more of him away. The goal wasn't just punishment. It was to turn a man into a cautionary tale, soaked in blood, etched in terror. Keelhauling was the sea's execution, a slow, suffocating trial by tide. It left scars that never healed, both on the skin and in the soul. It reminded every man on board that the ocean did not forgive, the captain did not forget, and that beneath the waves there was no justice, only pain. Whipping post. The whipping post was a tool of law and cruelty, a silent column of wood that bore witness to countless screams, tears, and torn flesh. It stood in town squares, marketplaces, and prison yards, not hidden away in dungeons, but placed where the world could watch. The condemned would be dragged to it, often half-naked, their hands tied high above their head or secured behind them. And then came the whip, thick leather cords, sometimes knotted with metal or bone, designed not to strike, but to rip. With each lash, skin split open in jagged lines. Blood poured, staining the ground and spraying the air. The first blow shocked the body. The fifth ignited fire under the skin. The 10th tore muscle, exposed bone, but the punishment rarely stopped there. Some endured 20, 50, even 100 lashes, each one a scream, each pause between them a moment of raw anticipation. They couldn't run, they couldn't hide, they could only feel. Crowds gathered, children watched, neighbors stood silent or laughed. The person tied to the post was reduced to an example, their body a billboard of warning, and afterward they were left to stumble away, back lacerated, spirit shattered, clothing sticking to wounds. Infection often followed. Scars never left. The whip didn't just hurt, it branded. The whipping post didn't ask questions. It didn't offer redemption. It delivered agony in public, turning pain into performance. And long after the victim collapsed, the post stood still, silent, splintered, stained with stories that no one could forget. Branding with hot irons. Branding with hot irons was not just a punishment, it was a lifelong curse seared into the skin, used on criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, and those marked for shame. It transformed human flesh into a billboard of guilt. The process was ritualistic and slow, meant not only to burn, but to define. First, the iron itself, shaped into a letter, a symbol, a royal crest, was heated until it glowed red, a pulsing ember of judgment. Then the condemned, stripped and restrained, was forced to remain still, knowing the pain was coming and that it would never leave. When the iron met the skin, it hissed like a snake. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, thick, acrid, unforgettable. Nerves screamed as the tissue bubbled and blackened, fusing with the shape of the metal. Whether it was a T for thief, an F for felon, or a fleur-de-lis for runaway slaves, the mark became part of their identity. It couldn't be hidden. It couldn't be washed away. It was a scar that shouted before you even opened your mouth. The branding wasn't just physical punishment. It was social exile. Wherever they went, people would see the mark and recoil. Employers, neighbors, even strangers would treat them as less than human. For many, branding destroyed any chance of redemption. For some, it led to suicide. For others, it meant a life in the shadows, hunted by their own history. Branding burned more than flesh. It burned dignity, hope, and the right to be forgotten. It was a punishment meant not to kill the body, but to kill the future. The Cradle of Judah. The Cradle of Judah was a punishment that fused geometry with grotesque pain, a device that turned stillness into torture and rest into ruin. Often confused with other medieval torment instruments, this cradle was no place of comfort. It was a triangular seat, its edge sharpened to a merciless point, mounted high above the ground. The condemned would be stripped naked and suspended above it with ropes tied to their limbs, arms stretched, legs splayed, and then slowly, unbearably lowered down. The point of the triangle would press into the perineum, that vulnerable seam of flesh between the genitals and anus. It didn't pierce immediately. It didn't need to. The torment lay in the gradual descent, millimeter by millimeter, as the body's weight bore down on a shape never meant to hold it. Muscles tore, skin split, nerves screamed, but still they hung there, gravity becoming the executioner, pulling them deeper into a sharpened embrace. The ropes could be tightened and released, forcing the victim to rise slightly, only to be dropped again, letting the full impact drive the point deeper. This rhythm of false hope and returned agony broke not just the body, but the will. Blood would soak the wood, infection would set in, days could pass before death arrived, and until it did, the victim was trapped, impaled not by blade, but by design. The Cradle of Judah was not loud. It didn't scream for attention, but it turned the human body into its own torture device. It made stillness unbearable and pain infinite, all from a single, silent edge being buried alive. Being buried alive is one of humanity's most primal nightmares, an execution not of fire or blade, but of silence, pressure, and airless terror. This punishment was used in different forms across centuries, as legal execution for heretics, adulterers, or unwed mothers, as vengeance, or as a ritualistic horror meant to cleanse society of its undesirables. The condemned was bound or left helpless, laid into a shallow grave or sealed inside a coffin, and then the soil began to fall. Each handful a countdown, each thud a tolling bell of doom. At first it was disbelief, a scream, a sob, a plea muffled by dirt and distance. But then came the weight, the crushing, breathless press of the earth against the chest, the face, the mouth. Darkness became absolute. The air grew thick, stale, and hot. The heart pounded louder than the silence. Panic set in like fire. You tried to move, but there was nowhere to go. You called for help, but no one heard. The world shrank to a box of earth and fear. Some died quickly, from suffocation, panic, or the collapse of the lungs under pressure. Others lingered for hours, fully conscious in a prison of soil, screaming into nothing until the mind broke. Fingernails clawed through wood and dirt until they tore away. Eyes bulged, mouths filled with sand, and time, slow and cruel, passed. Being buried alive wasn't just execution, it was erasure, a silent descent into nothingness, a death where no one watched, no one listened, and the final sound was the soil above settling into silence, a punishment that didn't burn, slice, or scream, but simply crushed everything you were until not even your breath remained. Thrown to wild beasts. To be thrown to wild beasts was to be delivered into the jaws of nature at its most savage, in a theater where death was not just expected, it was demanded. Used by ancient civilizations like Rome, this punishment was staged in grand arenas where thousands gathered not in mourning but in excitement. The condemned were often criminals, slaves, dissenters, or prisoners of war, stripped of weapons, dignity, and hope. They stood alone on the blood-soaked sands, surrounded by towering walls and echoing jeers. Then the gates opened. From the shadows emerged lions, tigers, leopards, starved, enraged, muscle rippling beneath fur. There was no escape. The animals lunged, not with hesitation, but with primal hunger. Flesh tore like cloth. Bones snapped under the weight of claws. Screams rose, were drowned by roars, and then silenced entirely. Some victims were devoured in moments. Others endured, bitten, dragged, mutilated, left conscious long enough to feel every crunch, every rip. Blood painted the sand. Limbs were torn free. Faces were erased. The beasts did not kill cleanly. They killed completely, with nature's indifference and an audience's approval. This was no execution. It was entertainment. The crowd cheered. Children laughed. Emperors nodded with satisfaction. The victims' terror became spectacle. Their agony, a story told in teeth and gore. Even in death, there was no peace. Remains were discarded, bones forgotten. The arena was washed clean, ready for the next body. To be thrown to wild beasts wasn't just to die. It was to be erased, shredded from history by fang and claw, under the sun, beneath applause. The Iron Chair. The Iron Chair was a throne of pure agony, built not for royalty, but for ruin. Made entirely of metal, this monstrous seat was covered with hundreds of sharp spikes jutting from the backrest, the arms, the seat, even the footrest. Victims were stripped naked and forced to sit upon it. Their skin met the spikes, sometimes already trembling, from days of beatings or starvation, and then leather straps or iron bars would pin them in place, tight, immovable, ensuring every needle of pain pressed deeper with each breath, each heartbeat, each tiny movement of desperation. The cruelty didn't stop there. Often a fire was lit beneath the chair, slowly heating the iron until it seared the flesh. The spikes, once cold instruments of puncture, became blazing fangs. The body roasted from below, cooking the muscles while the metal needles scorched nerves raw. Smoke rose from the skin, blisters formed and burst. The scent of charred humanity filled the air as the victim howled, unable to shift even an inch without shredding themselves further. Some victims were interrogated on the iron chair. Torturers would question them calmly, pausing between answers to turn up the heat or tighten the bindings. Others were left there for hours, even days, until infection, shock, or blood loss took them. This wasn't just torture, it was display, a performance of control, domination, and inescapable pain. The iron chair didn't kill quickly, it prolonged every second, burning itself into the victim's body and the memory of all who watched. It wasn't execution, it was endurance, until there was nothing left to endure. Rolled downhill in barrels. Rolled downhill in barrels was a punishment that disguised horror behind absurdity until the screams began. It sounds almost comical at first, like something from a crude tale or cruel folklore. But in truth, this method turned gravity and momentum into instruments of raw, chaotic brutality. The condemned would be forced into a large wooden barrel, sometimes with iron spikes driven through the inside walls, other times with nothing but rough splinters and hard, unyielding wood. Once sealed or restrained within, the barrel was positioned at the crest of a steep hill. There was no ceremony, no crowd control, just the sudden terrifying lurch as the barrel was pushed, and the world tilted sideways forever. Inside, the person had no control. They were tossed violently with every turn, their body flung against spikes or wood, bones fracturing as limbs smashed against the walls, heads split open, teeth shattered, the body tumbled into itself, trapped in a storm of wood and flesh, every second bringing a new impact, a new dislocation, a new scream swallowed by velocity. And it didn't stop quickly. The hill was often long, the descent brutal. By the time the barrel slammed to a halt, broken against rocks or trees, the person inside was rarely alive. If they were, they emerged mangled, concussed, bleeding from every joint, their mind fractured by the spinning chaos of pain. This wasn't just execution, it was chaos made punishment, a descent into violence where every rotation rewrote the body. It made a mockery of balance, it weaponized the earth, and it ended with a silence that echoed louder than any laugh. The wooden horse. The wooden horse was a punishment that turned a symbol of riding into a grotesque instrument of torture, designed not to kill, but to tear, stretch, and humiliate the human body until it could no longer stand or even sit. The device itself was deceptively simple, a triangular wooden beam, its top edge sharpened into a ridge like the spine of a blade. The condemned, often stripped bare, was forced to straddle it like a horse, legs spread wide, genitals pressed directly against the sharp edge, arms sometimes bound behind the back to prevent escape. And then came the weight. Chains, stones, or heavy weights were fastened to the ankles, dragging the body downward, pressing skin and flesh against the ridge. The pressure didn't wound immediately, it carved slowly. Skin tore, muscles ripped, the inner thighs split open. Blood ran down the sides of the beam in thin, steady streams. Nerve endings screamed. The victim could not shift, could not stand, could not stop it. Every second was agony. Some were left on the horse for minutes, others for hours. Some lost the ability to walk, others bled into unconsciousness. Laughter from guards and onlookers turned pain into spectacle. This was humiliation made physical, especially for women, especially for men accused of weakness. The wooden horse didn't just punish the body, it shattered pride, it mocked masculinity, it desecrated dignity. When they were finally lifted off, if they were, their legs trembled, blood soaked the ground, and every breath they took carried the echo of that blade beneath them, a scar they'd feel with every step, every memory, forever. Starvation cells. Starvation cells were not chambers of screams or torture devices built to draw blood. They were tombs crafted for silence, for slow, deliberate decay, used in medieval dungeons, totalitarian prisons, and inquisitorial chambers. These rooms were small, sealed, and barren, devoid of light, warmth, or sound. Victims were locked inside with nothing but their own body and the echo of their breath. No food, no water, no relief. At first the body protested. Hunger gnawed from the inside, a dull ache that grew sharper with every hour. The lips cracked, the tongue swelled, the stomach twisted itself into knots of desperation. But what truly destroyed the victim was the silence, the complete unbroken stillness. No voices, no sunlight, just time, dragging like a noose tightening with every second. After days without nourishment, the body began to consume itself. Muscles shrank, skin stretched thin over bone. Hallucinations set in, visions of food, voices of loved ones, the imagined sound of footsteps that never came. The mind, once a refuge, turned on itself. The victim would cry out, but no one answered. They would claw at the walls, but nothing gave, and eventually they would collapse, too weak to stand, too dry to weep, too broken to pray. Death came not as a blow, but as surrender. It was slow, pitiful, and unseen. No one watched, no one cared. The cells swallowed the person whole, body, memory, identity. And when the door was finally opened, days or weeks later, there was nothing left but silence, a hollow space where a human once breathed, now filled with emptiness and dust, a death that whispered instead of screamed. Death marches. Death marches were not executions in the traditional sense. They were calculated acts of extermination disguised as transportation. Victims, often prisoners of war, political dissidents, or persecuted minorities, were forced to walk for miles, sometimes hundreds, under brutal conditions. No food, no water, no shelter, no mercy. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot. Those who begged for rest were answered with rifle butts or bayonet tips. And still, they walked, barefoot, starving, bleeding. The most infamous occurred during the Holocaust, the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, and Stalin's forced relocations. But the horror was always the same. These marches were not meant to move people. They were meant to erase them, to grind them into the earth through heat stroke, hypothermia, infection, exhaustion. The body would eat itself as muscles failed. Blisters opened and limbs swelled with infection. The dead lined the path like milestones, their bodies left to rot in the sun or freeze in the snow, silent witnesses to the fate of those still staggering forward. And there were no clean deaths, no ceremonies, just silence, collapse, and a gunshot to the back of the head. Mothers were torn from children, elderly were trampled, friends watched each other crumble, unable to help without sharing the same fate. Death marches weren't punishment, they were psychological warfare designed to drain hope, to turn human beings into shadows before extinguishing them completely. Survival was a crime in itself, because to survive, you had to watch and remember and carry the weight of every fallen step forever. Foot roasting. Foot roasting was a punishment of focused agony, designed to destroy not the whole body, but one part of it so thoroughly that every nerve, every scream, every second became a cathedral of suffering. Used in dungeons, inquisitions, and interrogation chambers throughout history, this method didn't spill blood. It burned slowly, quietly, deeply. The victim would be bound to a chair or rack, ankles strapped down tightly, feet bare, exposed, and helpless. Beneath them, hot coals or a slow burning fire would be placed, close enough to kiss the souls, but not so close as to kill too quickly. At first, the skin would redden, then blister, then peel. The pain didn't strike like lightning. It crept like a snake, curling into the marrow, turning every inch of the foot into a battlefield of fire. Executioners knew exactly how to control the heat. They adjusted distance, intensity, time. If the prisoner passed out, they would be revived, only to feel the torment resume. If they confessed too soon, the flames would remain, to test sincerity. The smell was unforgettable, charred flesh, burned hair, melting skin, and the sounds, screams so primal they stripped away language, leaving only the voice of raw, human suffering. Some torturers applied oil or fat to the feet to intensify the burn. Others used iron grates or boots filled with hot embers. Even for those who survived, the scars were eternal, nerve endings destroyed, flesh permanently blackened or missing. Every step for the rest of their life became a memory of fire. Foot roasting was more than torture. It was a reminder that pain, when precise and patient, could turn a simple flame into a weapon of pure despair. Acid mutilation. Acid mutilation is a punishment that does not stop at pain. It devours identity. It is not swift. It is not clean. It is a slow burning obliteration of the human face, the human form, and the human soul, most often used as an act of vengeance or dominance. This form of punishment is carried out by throwing or pouring corrosive acid, usually sulfuric or hydrochloric, directly onto a person's body. The face is the most common target. The face, where the world looks, where expression lives, where humanity speaks. The moment acid touches skin, it hisses, boils, and eats. The victim feels their flesh melting in real time. Eyelids fuse, lips disintegrate, nerves scream, skin blackens, bubbles and sloughs off in chunks. The pain is not just unbearable, it is unending. Hours pass before it dulls, days before it stops. The wounds don't scab, they crater, bones are exposed, features are lost. But the agony doesn't end with the body, it begins there. What follows is a life in pieces. A mirror becomes a weapon. Strangers stare, children cry, society recoils, survivors are forced into hiding, isolation, surgeries, and silence. The punishment lingers in every photo, every whisper, every reflection. It's not just destruction, it's exile from the world of faces, of beauty, of belonging. Acid mutilation doesn't correct. It punishes through permanence. It doesn't just disfigure the flesh. It annihilates the self. And in every scar left behind, there is the memory of a moment, a splash, a scream, and a life that never looked the same again. Slave branding. Slave branding was a punishment and control method designed not only to scar flesh, but to dehumanize. To own someone, to claim that their body was property, wasn't enough. The mark had to be visible, permanent, painful. It was seared into skin with hot iron, a symbol of ownership, punishment, or betrayal burned into the body like a curse that could never be undone. Men, women, and even children were dragged out, restrained, and forced to submit to a fire they did not deserve. The iron would glow red, hissing in the flame, while the victim writhed beneath the weight of shackles or the arms of captors. Then it was pressed to the flesh, chest, back, shoulder, cheek. There was a scream. There was always a scream. Flesh bubbled and blackened. The smell of burning skin clung to the air like death's breath. The pain was instant and unforgettable, but the shame lasted a lifetime. These marks were more than scars. They were declarations, letters or symbols to show ownership, betrayal, or escape, branded R for runaway, F for fugitive, SL for slave labor. The body became a living document of suffering. Branded slaves could be resold, but never freed from the label carved into them by heat and hate. Even after slavery, the scars remained, proof of torment, evidence of cruelty, a body that had been written on by fire. Slave branding wasn't just about control, it was about erasure. It stripped people of identity and forced them to wear their pain on the outside. Pain that spoke even when they could not. Pain that never healed. Human sacrifice. Human sacrifice was not merely death, it was a spectacle of blood, belief, and control, dressed in the robes of ritual and sacred destiny, practiced by civilizations such as the Aztecs, Mayans, ancient Carthaginians, and even early European and Asian cultures. It was carried out not as punishment for crime, but as an offering to gods, to spirits, to forces beyond comprehension. Victims were chosen, sometimes revered, other times enslaved, but all met the same end. their lives stripped from them to feed something invisible and insatiable. In Aztec temples, the heart was torn from the chest while it still beat. The priest's obsidian blade sliced through flesh and bone, blood erupting skyward as drums thundered and crowds chanted below. The body, now a hollowed shell, was cast down the temple steps like discarded meat. In some rites, the victims were burned alive, drowned, or buried beneath foundations to bless buildings with their suffering. Children, too, were sacrificed, told they were chosen, that their tears would bring rain. Their cries echoed through forests and mountains. But the horror wasn't just in the method, it was in the meaning. These were not murders born of rage or impulse. They were rehearsed, celebrated, enshrined in ritual. Entire communities watched, believing that bloodshed would nourish the earth, appease deities, or protect them from disaster. To be sacrificed was to become a vessel for fear disguised as devotion. The victim's death wasn't theirs alone. It belonged to the crowd, the priests, the gods, and in that offering, the line between worship and cruelty vanished, leaving behind only crimson-stained altars and a sky that never answered. Execution by firing squad. Execution by firing squad is swift in myth, but rarely in reality. It is death by ritual, violence cloaked in uniform, finality delivered through the synchronized rhythm of gunfire. This punishment has marched through history's battlefields, prison yards, and dictatorships, a performance of law or power with bullets for punctuation. The condemned is often bound or blindfolded, their back against a wall or post, hands tied tightly behind them, chest exposed like a target at a range. Soldiers line up in front, rifles raised, fingers hovering. Some are loaded with blanks, others with live rounds, so no single man knows who fires the killing shot. But the victim always knows the truth. They can hear the shuffling of boots, feel the beat of their own heart accelerating toward the unknown. There is no warmth, no last touch, just command shouted into the cold, and a sudden deafening crack that breaks the air and the body all at once. The bullets slam into flesh and bone like hammers, tearing through organs, ripping the body backwards. Blood erupts from the chest, sometimes the neck, sometimes the mouth. If the heart is missed, the pain is not instant. Victims gasp, gurgle, slump, still alive as boots approach for the coup de grace, a final shot to the head to silence what remains. Execution by firing squad isn't just about killing. It's about precision, spectacle, and shared guilt. It turns soldiers into executioners, uniforms into weapons, and the condemned into a canvas painted with obedience and death. There's no screaming, no fire, just the mechanical chorus of rifles, and a silence afterward that never quite fades. Guillotine. The guillotine was invented to bring humane execution to the masses, swift, efficient, clean, but behind its cold precision lay a horror no blade could mask. Rising during the French Revolution, it became the steel icon of terror, its tall wooden frame and angled blade a symbol of justice turned mechanical death. Crowds gathered, not in solemn silence, but with wild anticipation, cheering as the condemned were marched up the wooden steps, faces pale, eyes wide, breath shaking with the weight of final seconds. Atop the platform, the victims' hands were tied, their neck placed into the lunette, the heavy wooden collar that held them still. Above them loomed the gleaming blade, suspended like a silent promise. Then, with the pull of a lever, it dropped. It didn't slice. It thundered. Bone cracked. Arteries burst. Heads fell into a basket, still blinking, lips twitching. A moment of twitching awareness before the lights went out for good. The body below convulsed, spurting blood from the exposed neck, staining the wood, soaking the straw. But the guillotine wasn't just about death. It was about spectacle. Dozens of executions a day, heads lined in rows, blood draining into troughs. Families watched. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see better. Some kissed the blade before dying. Others screamed until the moment steel met flesh. Revolutionaries once praised it, later they feared it. One day you cheered beneath the scaffold, the next you knelt atop it. The guillotine was mercy sharpened into horror. It promised a quick death, but it delivered a legacy soaked in blood, silence, and the echo of falling steel. Kneecapping is a punishment that doesn't kill. It cripples, shatters, and leaves the victim forever imprisoned in their own broken body. It became most widely feared during the conflicts in Northern Ireland, used by paramilitary groups as a brutal form of street justice. But its horror transcends borders. The method is horrifyingly direct. A bullet or blunt object is used to destroy the kneecap or the area around it, instantly collapsing the structure of the leg. There is no warning. Victims are often dragged into alleyways, blindfolded, or sometimes even punished in front of their own homes. Then it happens. A hammer, a metal bar, or a gun. One blow, sometimes two. The kneecap doesn't just crack, it explodes. Ligaments tear. Bone fragments slice into surrounding muscle. Blood gushes, the leg jerks violently, and the victim screams. A scream not just of pain, but of the terrifying knowledge that they will never walk the same again. The damage is permanent. Surgery can't always repair it. Even if the bleeding stops, the victim is left with a twisted limb, a shattered gait, a shadow of the life they once walked in. But the deeper wound is psychological, knowing that mobility, independence, and dignity have been stolen in an instant. The message is clear. You will live, but not without punishment. You will survive, but not without remembering who did this to you every time you try to stand. Kneecapping isn't about death. It's about domination. It's about turning strength into helplessness, turning a person into a warning, living proof of what happens when control is defied. Eye gouging. Eye gouging was a punishment that went beyond pain. It extinguished the very windows of the soul. Used by empires, both ancient and medieval, from Byzantium to feudal Asia, and even in tribal justice systems, it was a brutal method of silencing rebellion, vengeance, or perceived disgrace. To lose your sight was not merely to suffer, it was to be cast into a prison of darkness, helpless and forever marked. The act itself was carried out with terrifying intimacy. The condemned would be restrained, head clamped in place as a dagger, iron spike, or even the executioner's thumbs drove into their eyes. The scream that followed wasn't just agony, it was terror, a howl of confusion as the world vanished in an instant. Blood spilled in thick streams, the eye burst like a soft fruit, nerves snapping like threads, pain erupting behind the skull as bones splintered and the brain recoiled. The victim didn't just lose sight, they lost balance, orientation, and a sense of being. Some were left with hollow sockets, others had molten metal poured in to cauterize and disfigure them further. In some cultures, eye gouging was used as a political sentence to leave traitors alive but broken, unable to lead, speak, or even move freely without help. It turned kings into beggars, warriors into shadows, and the aftermath was worse. Darkness wasn't silent, it was suffocating, forever trapped in a world without light, where memories of faces faded and fear crept in with every sound. This punishment didn't end at the moment of mutilation, it endured every day after, turning the victim into a living monument of warning, blind, bleeding, and utterly alone in an eternal night. Mouth sewn shut. Having the mouth sewn shut is a punishment that doesn't roar. It whispers horror through silence. It is the mutilation of voice, the brutal erasure of identity, and a chilling message carved into flesh. You will not speak again. Used by tyrants, prison guards, and torturers to punish defiance or rebellion, this punishment was not always about death. It was about control, visibility, humiliation. The condemned, sometimes bound and gagged beforehand to prevent biting or protest, would be forced still, on a chair, against a wall, or to the ground. Then, a thick needle, often dull and unclean, would pierce the skin of the lips, threading coarse twine or sinew through top and bottom. Each puncture brought blood. Each pull of the thread tightened the grip of silence. The lips ballooned with swelling, crusted with crimson, trembling from shock. Every stitch was a scream trapped inside. The pain wasn't just from the needle, but from the suffocation of expression, the aching need to cry out, to beg, to sob, all locked behind a wall of torn flesh and knotted string. In prisons, the punishment was meant to break morale. In the streets, it served as a warning. If the victim tried to eat, drink, or speak, the wounds reopened, tearing anew, bleeding again. Infection festered, fever followed, and even after the stitches were cut, if mercy came at all, the scars remained, twisted lines sealing once human lips into a permanent memory of silence. To sew a mouth shut is not just to quiet a voice. It is to make suffering visible, to turn the human face into a prison, and to show that even silence can bleed. Public amputation. Public amputation was punishment made into theater, violence carved into a lesson, played out before a crowd thirsty for justice, vengeance, or fear. This was not a private execution behind closed doors. It was a performance, and the condemned was both actor and victim. Accused thieves, rebels, or disobedient slaves were dragged into the town square, limbs bound, faces pale with terror, surrounded by the rusted tools of mutilation. A crowd gathered. Children clung to their mothers. Vendors sold food nearby. And then the sentence was read. A hand, a foot, a finger, sometimes more, removed by force, by blade, by axe. The executioner approached with terrifying calm, gripping an iron cleaver or crude saw. The victim was held down, screaming, shaking, pleading as the blade came down. Bones cracked like splintering wood, flesh split in a rush of blood, hot and fast. The stump spasmed, nerves flared like fire, and over it all rang the sound of the crowd. Cheers, gas, jeers, silence. A limb was lifted high, sometimes nailed to a wall, sometimes tossed aside like garbage. But the pain didn't end with the cut. Infection waited like a second executioner. Blood loss, fever, and rot crept in days later. And if the body survived, the shame never left. The missing hand marked them forever. Every glance reminded them. Every task became a struggle. Every night they felt the ghost of what had been taken. Public amputation didn't just remove flesh. It carved out freedom, dignity, and identity. It turned a person into a warning, a living scar, a breathing reminder that the state could take not just life, but pieces of it, one slice at a time. Outlaw status and excommunication. Outlaw status and excommunication were punishments that didn't require blood or shackles. They weaponized isolation, stripping a person not just of legal protection, but of belonging, identity, and even their place in eternity. To be declared an outlaw in medieval Europe meant you were no longer under the law's shield. Anyone could rob you, anyone could kill you, and no one would answer for it. You became prey in a world where the law had once sworn to protect you. You weren't just cast out, you were erased from civilization's conscience. Excommunication reached even deeper. It wasn't just a punishment from kings or courts, it was a spiritual death sentence. Declared by the church, it cut a person off from sacraments, from burial grounds, from the possibility of salvation. You were denied the comfort of last rites, denied the chance to be mourned, denied heaven. Families abandoned the excommunicated. Friends turned their backs. They weren't just socially rejected, they were seen as cursed, tainted, untouchable. Victims wandered the edges of villages, desperate for shelter, forbidden from entering homes or churches. Children would throw stones at them. They starved. They went mad. Some tried to atone, crawling barefoot for miles in the hopes of being forgiven. Others simply disappeared, lost in forests, eaten by winter, or slain by strangers who saw no sin in ending a life already condemned. This punishment didn't scar the skin, it hollowed out the soul. To be outlawed or excommunicated was to become invisible. In a world that once knew your name, it was to exist without identity, to die before death, and to be forgotten while still breathing. Tongue piercing and padlocking. Tongue piercing and padlocking was a punishment crafted with precision and malice, one that silenced a person not by cutting out their voice, but by imprisoning it inside their own body, used throughout history in various cultures to punish blasphemers, outspoken dissidents, and women deemed too vocal. It was both torture and warning. The act began with the victim restrained, mouth forced open with hooks or wooden gags. Then, without anesthetic or hesitation, a metal rod or spike was driven through the center of the tongue, pinning it in place with a brutal crunch of muscle and blood. But it didn't stop there. Through the hole, a small iron ring was inserted and then locked shut with a padlock. This was not jewelry. This was a prison cell, forged in fire, anchored in flesh. The weight of the lock dragged at the tongue constantly, making every movement a searing reminder of pain. Speaking became impossible. Eating was torture. Swallowing sent lightning bolts of agony through the skull. The victim drooled uncontrollably, bled for days, and often choked on their own fluids. The humiliation was as sharp as the pain. The padlock jingled as they moved, strangers stared, children recoiled. It was a brand, a muzzle, a message written in iron and silence. This person spoke too much, and now they would speak no more. Even after removal, the hole rarely healed cleanly. The tongue remained scarred, twisted, swollen, a grotesque echo of what was once a voice. This punishment didn't just hurt, it humiliated. It turned speech into suffering and silence into a lifelong sentence. Spiked coffin torture. Spiked coffin torture was a punishment designed to turn the very shape of burial into a weapon of the living. Unlike the quiet rest promised by death, this coffin was not meant for peace. It was meant for agony, prolonged and inescapable. Built to resemble a human-shaped box, it was lined inside with sharpened iron spikes, dozens, sometimes hundreds, angled inward, each one calculated to press against flesh, but not kill immediately. The condemned was stripped bare, trembling and bruised, and then forced inside. With agonizing precision, the lid was closed. The spikes didn't plunge in. They pressed into the ribs, the chest, the spine, the soft belly. They broke skin just enough to bleed, but not enough to bring relief. Every breath forced the body to shift. Every twitch drove metal deeper. They couldn't move to find comfort. They couldn't scream without tearing their lungs from within. The coffin became a second skin of pain, molding around them in cold, merciless silence. Sometimes the coffin was suspended in the air, rocking gently like a hanging cradle. Only this one whispered blood. Other times, it was left out in the sun or in the cold, so heat and frost could join the torture. Death took its time, hours, days, and inside that narrow tomb, the mind unraveled faster than the body. There was no dignity, no prayer, just darkness, steel, and 1,000 tiny knives that punished the sin of existence. The spiked coffin didn't burn, slice, or crush. It suffocated through stillness until silence became a scream echoing inside a box that was never meant to open again. Caning to death. Caning to death was not a swift execution. It was a slow, relentless unraveling of the human body under the crushing rhythm of brutality. Used in parts of Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, this punishment transformed a thin wooden rod into an instrument of devastating destruction. The condemned would be stripped naked, bound or restrained, their back, buttocks, or thighs exposed to the full force of the cane. There were no swords, no gallows, just the sound of wood slamming against flesh, and the screams that followed. The first strikes blistered the skin, the next tore it open. Blood seeped down in rivulets, muscles spasmed. The rod whistled through the air again and again and again. But this wasn't punishment for discipline. It was execution in increments. Strike after strike broke through skin, then fat, then muscle, sometimes exposing bone. The body writhed, then shivered, then went still, but the blows did not stop. The victim was kept conscious if possible, water thrown in their face, a moment of breath before the next wave of agony. The pain blurred vision, blood loss blurred reality. The cane itself would sometimes splinter from use, only to be replaced, continuing the rhythm of death. Organs ruptured, the spine curved unnaturally. Shock crept in like ice. When death finally arrived, it wasn't a release. It was a collapse, a body unrecognizable, caved in, skin shredded to pulp, blood soaked into the ground. Caning to death was not just physical punishment, it was psychological torment, a punishment that made death feel like mercy, and every moment before it, a hammer blow to the soul. Execution by cannon. Execution by cannon was not simply death, it was obliteration, a spectacle of total erasure, where the condemned wasn't just killed, but annihilated so violently that nothing recognizable remained. Used during colonial regimes, especially in 18th and 19th century India, this method was reserved for rebels, mutineers, and those who challenged imperial authority. The punishment served one purpose: to show that resistance would not just be crushed, it would be wiped from existence. The condemned would be dragged into the open, hands bound, eyes wide with horror as they were tied to the mouth of a loaded cannon, their back pressed against the cold iron barrel, arms and torso strapped tight with rope, legs trembling beneath them. There was no final word, no whisper of forgiveness, only the executioner's slow steps, a command, and then the deafening roar. The cannon exploded, and so did the body. It didn't fall, it didn't crumple, it disintegrated in an instant. Blood and bone vaporized into the air, limbs torn from sockets, ribs flung into the sky. The torso, a red mist. There was no corpse to mourn, no face to cover, no body to bury, just scattered pieces raining over dust and silence. The message was clear. Disobedience wouldn't just end in death, it would end in absence. This punishment stripped away even the dignity of a final form. Execution by cannon was power incarnate. It turned the human body into an echo, a stain on the wind, a warning that some rulers didn't just want you dead, they wanted you gone, forever. Beheading was once seen as the most dignified of executions, swift, clean, and final, but behind its supposed mercy lies a punishment soaked in dread, spectacle, and cold ceremony. Used across empires from the Middle East to Europe to Asia, it was a sentence handed down to kings and commoners alike, a blade poised between power and mortality. The condemned would be led forward, often bound and kneeling, the weight of death pressing on their shoulders long before the blade ever touched skin. The silence before the strike was suffocating. A heartbeat became a thunderclap. Some sobbed, some recited prayers through clenched teeth, others simply stared ahead, frozen, accepting. The executioner, hooded or barefaced, with eyes hardened by routine, raised the weapon, an axe, a sword, or later, the guillotine's blade. Then, with a single motion, or sometimes several, the head was severed. But it wasn't always clean, it wasn't always fast. A dull blade could turn mercy into torment. Screams still echoed as the axe thudded once, twice, 3 times. Arteries sprayed like fountains, eyes rolled back, and the crowd, watching from steps, windows, the edges of their own comfort, cheered, wept, or whispered in horror. The severed head for a moment often remained alive. Eyelids blinked, lips quivered, a final expression locked in time. The body collapsed in spasms, blood pooled like ink, and the silence that followed was never clean. It was heavy, stunned, and final. Beheading did not just end life, it captured it in a single violent image. The instant a soul is torn from flesh, and nothing remains but a head in a basket, staring at the world it just left behind. Nailing to the floor. Nailing to the floor was a punishment that fused flesh to earth, where the victim was not only tortured, but pinned, anchored, and bound to a place of suffering with no escape. Used by sadistic regimes, warlords, and inquisitors alike, this method began with a person already beaten, stripped, and broken in spirit. They were thrown to the ground, limbs spread out unnaturally, often on a wooden surface or stone floor. Then came the nails, thick iron spikes, not clean or sharp, but crude and rusted, driven through hands, feet, knees, or shoulders. The hammer rose, the hammer fell, bones cracked, nerves split open. The floor became a second skin, one that bled and screamed with every breath. The person could do nothing but convulse, their body trying to recoil from the pain, only to be reminded violently that they were nailed in place. Movement tore the wounds deeper. Struggling meant more damage. Every second stretched into hours. Sometimes nails were driven through clothing so tightly that blood couldn't flow, leading to rot and infection while the victim still lived. The torment wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Being nailed down stripped you of choice, of dignity, of even the small defiance of flinching away from pain. Some victims were left to die slowly, dehydration creeping in as they sobbed for release. Others were tortured while fixed in place, whipped, mocked, or mutilated further, unable to escape or defend themselves. This was not execution, it was transformation. A living person turned into an object, impaled, displayed, and forgotten. Nailing to the floor wasn't about justice. It was about control. It was about making someone less than human, pinned like an insect, bleeding into the cracks, and begging the ground to let them go. Strappado was a punishment built to destroy the human body without drawing a single drop of blood. It required no flames, no blades, only a rope, a beam, and the weight of a person's own limbs turned cruelly against them. The victim's hands were tied tightly behind their back, forcing the shoulders into a strained, unnatural position. Then they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, lifted high, bones grinding, tendons tearing, breath stolen by agony. But that was only the beginning. Without warning, the executioner would release the rope, dropping the victim suddenly and violently, only to be stopped inches from the ground by a brutal jolt. The arms snapped backward, and the shoulders often dislocated instantly. The entire weight of the body was used as a weapon against itself, and once the screaming started, it echoed through stone walls and wooden beams like a song composed of pain. The torturers would do it again and again, each drop worse than the last. The victim didn't just suffer, he unraveled. Nerves were crushed, muscles tore apart, wrists shattered, the body dangled helplessly, twitching, spasming, begging to fall fully, but the rope never broke. Strappado was the art of not letting someone die too quickly. The agony left them maimed, their arms useless, nerves damaged beyond repair. And the worst part? They were usually conscious for every second, every crack, every drop, every scream. It didn't kill the person. It left them hanging on the edge of life, ruined, with the knowledge that their own body had been turned against them in the most inhuman way possible. Beheading was once seen as the most dignified of executions, swift, clean, and final. But behind its supposed mercy lies a punishment soaked in dread, spectacle, and cold ceremony. Used across empires from the Middle East to Europe to Asia, it was a sentence handed down to kings and commoners alike, a blade poised between power and mortality. The condemned would be led forward, often bound and kneeling, the weight of death pressing on their shoulders long before the blade ever touched skin. The silence before the strike was suffocating. A heartbeat became a thunderclap. Some sobbed, some recited prayers through clenched teeth, others simply stared ahead, frozen, accepting. The executioner, hooded or barefaced with eyes hardened by routine, raised the weapon, an axe, a sword, or later, the guillotine's blade. Then, with a single motion, or sometimes several, the head was severed. But it wasn't always clean. It wasn't always fast. A dull blade could turn mercy into torment. Screams still echoed as the axe thudded once, twice, 3 times. Arteries sprayed like fountains. Eyes rolled back. And the crowd, watching from steps, windows, the edges of their own comfort, cheered, wept, or whispered in horror. The severed head for a moment often remained alive. Eyelids blinked, lips quivered, a final expression locked in time. The body collapsed in spasms. Blood pooled like ink, and the silence that followed was never clean. It was heavy, stunned, and final. Beheading did not just end life. It captured it in a single violent image. The instant a soul is torn from flesh, and nothing remains but a head in a basket, staring at the world it just left behind. Execution by cannon. Execution by cannon was not simply death, it was obliteration, a spectacle of total erasure, where the condemned wasn't just killed, but annihilated so violently that nothing recognizable remained. Used during colonial regimes, especially in 18th and 19th century India, this method was reserved for rebels, mutineers, and those who challenged imperial authority. The punishment served one purpose: to show that resistance would not just be crushed, it would be wiped from existence. The condemned would be dragged into the open, hands bound, eyes wide with horror, as they were tied to the mouth of a loaded cannon, their back pressed against the cold iron barrel, arms and torso strapped tight with rope, legs trembling beneath them. There was no final word, no whisper of forgiveness, only the executioner's slow steps, a command, and then the deafening roar. The cannon exploded, and so did the body. It didn't fall, it didn't crumple, it disintegrated in an instant. Blood and bone vaporized into the air, limbs torn from sockets, ribs flung into the sky. The torso, a red mist. There was no corpse to mourn, no face to cover, no body to bury, just scattered pieces, raining over dust and silence. The message was clear. Disobedience wouldn't just end in death, it would end in absence. This punishment stripped away even the dignity of a final form. Execution by cannon was power incarnate. It turned the human body into an echo, a stain on the wind, a warning that some rulers didn't just want you dead, they wanted you gone, forever. Nailing to the floor was a punishment that fused flesh to earth, where the victim was not only tortured, but pinned, anchored, and bound to a place of suffering with no escape. Used by sadistic regimes, warlords, and inquisitors alike, this method began with a person already beaten, stripped, and broken in spirit. They were thrown to the ground, limbs spread out unnaturally, often on a wooden surface or stone floor. Then came the nails, thick iron spikes, not clean or sharp, but crude and rusted, driven through hands, feet, knees, or shoulders. The hammer rose, the hammer fell, bones cracked, nerves split open. The floor became a second skin, one that bled and screamed with every breath. The person could do nothing but convulse, their body trying to recoil from the pain, only to be reminded violently that they were nailed in place. Movement tore the wounds deeper. Struggling meant more damage. Every second stretched into hours. Sometimes nails were driven through clothing so tightly that blood couldn't flow, leading to rot and infection while the victim still lived. The torment wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Being nailed down stripped you of choice, of dignity, of even the small defiance of flinching away from pain. Some victims were left to die slowly, dehydration creeping in as they sobbed for release. Others were tortured while fixed in place, whipped, mocked, or mutilated further, unable to escape or defend themselves. This was not execution, it was transformation. A living person turned into an object, impaled, displayed, and forgotten. Nailing to the floor wasn't about justice, it was about control. It was about making someone less than human, pinned like an insect, bleeding into the cracks, and begging the ground to let them go. Public drunkenness pillories. Public drunkenness pillories weren't designed to end a life. They were crafted to strip it bare. These weren't torture devices in the traditional sense, but they delivered a different kind of suffering, one rooted in humiliation, degradation, and the slow unraveling of a person's dignity before their community. The drunkard, often stumbling, ashamed, or still belligerent, was dragged through the streets, mocked by onlookers, and forced into the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and arms, locking them in a bent, exposed position. The punishment wasn't private. That was the point. These pillories were placed in town squares, at church doors, or at busy crossroads, designed so that everyone, from elders to children, could pass by and bear witness. People would throw rotten vegetables, stones, or worse. They spat, they laughed, they mocked. The drunkard's name became a punchline, their face the symbol of disgrace. Time passed slowly in that wooden trap. Hours, sometimes a full day. The sun burned, rain soaked, boredom turned to shame, shame turned to agony. There was no escape from the eyes, no hiding from whispered insults or sharp words from people who once called you friend. The body ached, the wrists swelled, the neck stiffened, and still you stood, trapped in a performance of public judgment where the audience never left. The real punishment wasn't the pillory itself. It was what came after, the looks that lingered, the laughter that never stopped, the way children pointed at you long after the stocks were empty, a punishment that lived on in memory, long after the wood had let go. Coffin torture. Coffin torture was a punishment of suffocating cruelty, an execution of spirit long before death arrived. Unlike the spiked coffin, this method didn't pierce flesh with blades. It used space, or the lack of it, to crush dignity, sanity, and breath. The condemned would be forced into the human-shaped iron cage or wooden box, barely large enough to contain a body, often smaller. They were bound inside, arms twisted, knees to chest, head bowed unnaturally, locked in a shape that denied motion and mercy. The coffin was then hoisted upright and left outside. There, exposed to the elements and the eyes of the public, the victim became a grotesque monument. Rain soaked their skin. Flies crawled into their mouth and eyes. The sun blistered their face. Children mocked. Strangers threw rotten food, excrement, stones. The torture wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Inside the box, they couldn't move, couldn't scratch an itch, couldn't breathe fully. Every heartbeat was a drumbeat of helplessness. The body began to cramp, swell, collapse inward. Sometimes they were left for hours, sometimes for days. When death came, it arrived in silence, through dehydration, starvation, heat stroke, or the slow failure of organs compressed too long. But before that came delirium, hallucinations, and the desperate wish to scream, if only there were room to draw breath. Coffin torture was not about blood, it was about invisibility within visibility. The world could see you, laugh at you, spit at you, but you could do nothing. It was a punishment that shrunk a person into nothing, crushed by wood, by shame, by the weight of being watched while dying, inch by inch in a box shaped like a grave. Neck violin. The neck violin was not an instrument of music. It was an instrument of mockery, pain, and public shame. Emerging in 18th century Europe, especially in Germany and the Netherlands, this punishment was designed to humiliate and immobilize rather than kill. It targeted those accused of gossip, bickering, blasphemy, or social defiance, often women. The device itself was a heavy, rigid wooden collar shaped like a violin or yoke, clamped tightly around the neck and wrists, forcing the arms upward in a grotesque display of discomfort. Once locked in, the wearer couldn't lower their arms, turn their head, or hide their face. Every twitch sent waves of pain through the neck and shoulders. Muscles cramped, joints stiffened, the body ached. But the worst pain wasn't in the flesh, it was in the eyes of the crowd. People would laugh, spit, throw garbage. Children pointed, neighbors whispered. For hours or days, the condemned stood exposed, frozen in shame, unable to eat, drink, or even wipe away tears. Sometimes, two offenders were locked into the same device, forced to face one another, cheek to cheek, breath to breath, until their hatred turned to exhaustion. No escape, no space, just shared misery and blistering humiliation. The neck violin turned the human body into a display of disgrace. It was a punishment that played no music, only silence, pain, and public judgment. And long after it was removed, its weight lingered in the neck, in the shoulders, in the heart, because it didn't just restrain the body, it strangled pride and left a melody of shame that never quite stopped playing. The boot was a device of precision-engineered agony, crafted not to kill swiftly, but to destroy a person's ability to stand, walk, or ever feel whole again. Used in medieval Europe and refined in later centuries, it looked simple, a heavy wooden or metal casing that enclosed the leg from ankle to knee. But once the limb was trapped inside, the real horror began. Wedges, thick, unforgiving blocks of wood or iron, were driven between the boot and the flesh, one by one, with a mallet. Each strike didn't just tighten the space, it shattered what was inside it. At first came the pressure, then the cracking, the tibia split, the fibula snapped, ligaments tore like paper, bones crumbled inward into flesh, blood gushed from within the boot, pooling beneath the victim's seat, and all the while, the leg remained locked in place. No room to move, no way to recoil, only the unbearable truth that each scream might only bring another wedge, another hammer, another layer of devastation. Sometimes heated boots were used, baking the skin while the bones shattered within. Others were lined with spikes or filled with molten substances to sear from the inside. The torture was methodical, controlled, each minute dragged out with clinical intent, not to extract truth but to break resolve. Even if the victim survived, they never walked again. Their leg, now mangled beyond repair, became a permanent monument to their pain. The boot didn't just crush bones, it crushed will. It turned strength into ruin. And long after the screams faded, the sound of the hammer, measured, relentless, remained cat o' nine tails. The cat o' nine tails was not just a whip, it was a sentence carved into flesh, used across centuries by naval forces, prisons, and slave drivers. This weapon was designed for one purpose: to flay. Its name came from its brutal construction: 9 leather thongs, often knotted or tipped with bone, metal, or glass, each acting like a claw tearing into skin. When it struck, it didn't simply lash, it shredded. The condemned, often stripped bare, was tied to a post or a mast, body exposed and trembling. The air would go silent, then the whip cracked. 1 stroke, skin split open. 2, muscle tore. 3, blood sprayed. With each swing, the pain multiplied. There was no mercy, no place to hide from the burn that bloomed across the back like fire blooming in slow motion. Flesh came away in ragged flaps. The spine could be exposed. The victim would scream until their voice collapsed. But it wasn't over after 10 lashes, or 20. Some endured 100. Bones fractured beneath the blows. Some went into shock. Some died mid-sentence. Others survived, but they never walked the same, never slept the same, never lived untouched by the memory. The scars from the cat o' nine tails weren't just physical, they were psychological branding, a lifetime reminder of punishment, of submission, of being broken in front of others. Even after the wounds healed, the whispers followed. People remembered, because this whip didn't just punish, it erased pride, identity, and the illusion that anyone could be untouchable. It made sure pain lived on, long after the blood had dried. Execution by toxic fumes. Execution by toxic fumes was a punishment that turned the very act of breathing into betrayal. It killed slowly, invisibly, from the inside out, without blade, without fire, without even the mercy of external wounds. Used in ancient mines, sealed chambers, and secret prisons throughout history, It preyed on the body's most desperate need, air. The condemned would be forced into a confined space, often a sealed room, underground cell, or even a hollowed-out pit, where fresh oxygen was scarce and something far more sinister waited in its place. Sometimes it was smoke from burning sulfur, sometimes ammonia, lime, or rotting organic matter. In more advanced eras, it was industrial gas, carbon monoxide, chlorine, or hydrogen sulfide. There were no screams, only coughing at first, then burning in the eyes, fire in the lungs. The air felt thick, heavy, impossible to swallow. They clawed at their throat as it tightened, eyes bulging, mind spiraling into panic as every breath carried more poison. But the true horror came not in the moment of death, but in the moments before, the realization that every breath was a step toward unconsciousness, then paralysis, then nothing. Muscles spasmed, vomit spilled, blood seeped from the nose, and yet the body refused to shut down quickly. It clung to life, to breath, even as the lungs turned into chambers of fire and foam. Execution by toxic fumes was silence wrapped in suffering. There was no heroic end, no wound to mourn, just a collapsing figure shuddering on the floor of a room filled with invisible murder, where death came not with a scream, but with a final, poisoned breath. Breast Ripper. The breast ripper was a torture device forged not just in iron, but in misogyny and terror. Its sole purpose, to mutilate women in the most personal, irreversible way imaginable. Used in medieval Europe, particularly during witch trials or to punish alleged adultery, blasphemy, or heresy, the device was a claw-like iron instrument, often heated until red-hot, designed to shred and rip the breasts from the chest. Slowly, methodically, and publicly, the woman would be stripped bare, arms bound so tightly she couldn't move, couldn't shield herself, couldn't even breathe without feeling the sting of anticipation. The torturer would then press the iron claws against her chest. Sometimes they were dragged slowly, tearing through skin and tissue. Other times they were clamped, then violently pulled away, taking flesh with them. The pain was not a sharp scream. It was a deep, animalistic wail, a sound of pure disbelief that such cruelty could exist. Blood poured from open wounds. Nerves were severed. Skin hung in ribbons. The woman remained conscious through most of it, trembling, broken, her chest a ruin of torn flesh and fire. But it wasn't just meant to destroy her body. It was to obliterate her womanhood, her dignity, her ability to nurture, to be seen without horror. Crowds watched. They said it was justice, a warning, but it was torture disguised as righteousness. Punishment meant to silence, to erase, to annihilate. The breast ripper didn't just tear at flesh, it tore at identity, reducing a woman to nothing more than pain and screams beneath iron teeth and the unblinking eyes of cruelty. Slipper beating may sound tame, almost comical in name, but in truth, it was a method of punishment rooted in humiliation, control, and pain, often used in Eastern and Southeast Asian countries, as well as in certain colonial systems. It was inflicted on prisoners, soldiers, slaves, and even children. The tool was simple, a shoe or sandal made of hard rubber, leather, or wood, but the suffering it caused was anything but simple. The beating was most commonly administered to the soles of the feet, a technique known as falanga, where hundreds of nerves hide beneath deceptively tough skin. The victim was bound, legs extended, feet bare, and vulnerable. Then the slipper would descend, again and again. At first it stung, sharp and biting. Then came the swelling, the skin turning purple, splitting, leaking blood. But it didn't stop. Every blow struck deeper, reaching nerves, shattering capillaries, turning the act of standing into a distant dream. Screams erupted not only from pain, but from disbelief. How something so small could bring so much agony. There was no running, no fighting back. The pain was private, isolated to the feet, but it crippled the entire body. After enough strikes, Victims couldn't walk, couldn't crawl, couldn't even stand to relieve themselves, and that was the point, to break them with something ordinary, to show that no instrument of violence is too small when backed by authority and cruelty. Slipper beating didn't require fire, metal, or gallows, just humiliation, just repetition, and when it ended, it left behind not only broken feet, but a broken will and the echo of every step that could never be taken again. Forced self-mutilation. Forced self-mutilation is a punishment that twists cruelty into something even more diabolical, making the victim the instrument of their own destruction. It is not just a violation of the body, but a complete collapse of will, turning pain inward until the mind fractures. Used across brutal regimes, cults, and ancient rituals, this punishment forced individuals to cut, maim, or disfigure themselves under the threat of greater violence. It wasn't enough for the body to bleed. What mattered was who held the knife. Victims were given blades, broken glass, red-hot irons, and a choice that wasn't a choice at all. Mutilate yourself or suffer worse. Cut off your own fingers, gouge out your eye, disfigure your face. In some regimes, prisoners were ordered to carve slogans into their skin, or sever their genitals, or bite off their own tongue. And if they hesitated, loved ones were threatened. The violence doubled. The humiliation deepened. The body betrayed itself in trembling hands. Each cut was an act of despair, each drop of blood a confession. I am no longer mine. The pain was excruciating, yes, but the mental collapse was worse. People screamed as their minds broke, begged their own hands to stop, cried for mercy from themselves. There was no safe place to hide, not even within. And afterward, there was only silence, scars shaped by their own grip, shame that could never be washed away. Forced self-mutilation didn't just destroy the body, it destroyed agency, identity, and hope. It rewrote a person's humanity with their own blood and left them alive, only to remember every second they became their own executioner. Gibbeting was a punishment that turned death into a never-ending warning, a sentence that continued long after the heart stopped beating. Reserved for pirates, murderers, traitors, and thieves, it was not merely about execution, it was about what came after. Once the condemned was hanged, choking, kicking, strangling against the noose, they were not buried. Their body was not laid to rest. Instead, it was encased in a metal cage, limbs twisted into grotesque positions, the head lolling, eyes wide in frozen agony. Then the cage was hoisted high on a wooden post, exposed to the sky, the wind, and the stares of a silent, watching world. The corpse did not decay quietly. Over days, then weeks, then months, it bloated under the sun, cracked under frost, blackened with rot. Birds clawed at the flesh. Rats gnawed at the feet. Maggots crawled through eye sockets. Rain washed blood down rusted bars. The stench carried across fields, villages, harbors. Children cried at the sight. Parents pointed and whispered, "This is what happens to the wicked." And still, the body remained, a marionette of decay, dancing in the breeze, bones rattling like chains. In some cases, the gibbets were placed at crossroads or coastal paths where travelers couldn't help but look. The message was seared into memory. Crime does not end with death. Gibbeting was not execution. It was degradation stretched across time. A body turned into a billboard for fear. A soul denied dignity. A human being displayed like carrion, left to rot in plain sight, long after their voice had gone silent, but their punishment screamed on. Hook whipping was punishment turned into a savage ritual, a terrifying blend of lashing and tearing, designed to not only inflict pain, but to dismantle a person's body in front of witnesses. Used in certain tribal justice systems and by imperial enforcers across Asia and the Middle East, it combined the raw agony of flogging with something far more gruesome, iron hooks embedded into the whip's ends. These weren't made to sting, they were made to dig, to catch, to rip. The condemned would be bound, arms stretched tight above their head or chained to a post, their back exposed like a canvas. Then the executioner would begin. Each strike of the whip embedded the hooked ends deep into the skin. Then, with a vicious tug, flesh was torn away in long, ragged strips. Skin didn't bruise, it vanished. Blood sprayed, muscles were exposed, the screams were guttural, primal, desperate. There was no rhythm, just chaos. The crowd watched with wide eyes and twisted fascination as the person became less and less whole. Some fainted, only to be revived and whipped again. Others begged for death as their backs turned into shredded ruins. The hooks sometimes struck the face, the neck, even the legs. Anywhere flesh could be ripped away like wet paper. Hook whipping didn't stop when the body gave out. It stopped when the message was carved deep enough into flesh that no one would forget it. It was a punishment that left permanent damage, not just in scars, but in posture, in breathing, in the way a person would forever flinch at the sound of rope or metal. It didn't just break the skin, it broke the soul. Torture masks. Torture masks were grotesque tools of psychological destruction, crafted not to spill blood, but to steal identity, breath, and dignity in full view of society. Used across medieval Europe, especially during the Inquisition and witch trials, these iron devices were designed to dehumanize. They came in the shape of animals, demons, or distorted human faces, each welded to fit snugly over the victim's head. Some were sculpted with mocking expressions, long noses, gaping mouths, twisted grins, turning the condemned into living caricatures of their supposed sins. But the horror was not just in appearance. Inside, sharp metal spikes pressed into the face, tongue, or throat. Every movement drove them deeper. Speaking meant bleeding, swallowing became torture. Some masks locked the jaw or constricted the throat, making breathing shallow and painful. Others were fastened so tightly they caused bruising, broken teeth, or suffocation. And while the physical pain was searing, the greater agony was social. Victims were paraded through towns, chained, masked, and stripped of any semblance of humanity. Children laughed, adults jeered, stones were thrown. They weren't seen as people anymore. They were monsters, freaks, warnings to others. No one looked into their eyes. No one saw the person behind the iron. These masks didn't need time to kill. They killed the self, slowly, cruelly, publicly. And for those who lived, the damage never healed. Their faces bore the scars. Their minds bore the weight. Torture masks were not just punishment. They were transformation. They erased the soul and replaced it with shame. A human being turned into a symbol of fear, left to carry the iron ghost of what they once were. Salt rubbing in wounds. Salt rubbing in wounds is a punishment rooted in simplicity and savagery, exploiting the raw vulnerability of open flesh. It was used throughout history, from ancient battlefields to colonial prisons, not to kill, but to torture the body with agony so intimate it feels like betrayal. First, the wound is opened, maybe from a whip, maybe from a blade, maybe from hours of beating, skin torn, muscle exposed, nerves screaming beneath the blood. And then the salt comes, handfuls of coarse, white crystals pressed directly into the wound, ground in with fingers, sticks, or leather straps. The salt doesn't just sting, it invades, it digs into the tissue, clings to raw muscle, seeps into the bloodstream. It burns, it gnaws, it consumes. The pain is sharp, unrelenting, white-hot. Victims writhe, scream, beg for death, but death doesn't come. Not yet. Salt doesn't just hurt, it dehydrates, it inflames, it prevents healing. Wounds packed with salt fester and swell, turning red and black, the skin around them hardening like leather. Infections follow, fever rises. The body fights to close the wound, but the salt won't allow it. Every movement tears it open again. Every hour is another descent into unbearable, maddening torment. Sometimes the salt was used as punishment, sometimes as interrogation, sometimes just for spectacle. but always it left behind more than scars. It left pain that echoed in the bones long after the bleeding stopped. Salt rubbing isn't just cruelty, it's ritual pain, exquisite, personal, and unforgettable. It's taking what is already broken and setting it on fire from the inside out. Forced cannibalism. Forced cannibalism is a punishment that crosses every boundary of morality, humanity, and sanity. It is not just a physical violation, it is a psychological weapon designed to annihilate the soul, used in history's darkest corners by tyrants, warlords, and torturers. It was not only about survival, but about humiliation, degradation, and absolute control. Victims were not offered a choice. They were ordered, coerced, starved into desperation, or tortured until they submitted, and then they were made to consume human flesh, sometimes cooked, sometimes raw, sometimes that of strangers, sometimes their own. In the most horrifying accounts, prisoners were forced to eat pieces of their family members, sons, daughters, spouses, killed in front of them. Sometimes the flesh was carved from the living, fed to the victim as a demonstration of total power. Other times they were made to butcher the body themselves, their own hands delivering the cut, their own mouth the final betrayal, teeth clenched around muscle that should never be eaten, lips dripping with blood that once flowed through someone they loved. This punishment didn't just cause suffering, it shattered the very core of what it meant to be human. It turned nourishment into torment, survival into desecration. The act lived forever in the mind. Victims were never the same. They broke down, sobbed uncontrollably, clawed at their faces, begged for death after the fact. Some went mad, others remained silent for the rest of their lives, haunted by the taste of what should never be tasted. Forced cannibalism is not punishment, it is obliteration of love, of identity, of every moral thread that holds the human spirit together. And once it's done, there is no going back, only the echo of what was consumed and what was lost. Exposure to insects and elements. Exposure to insects and the elements was a punishment that required no blades, no fire, just time, vulnerability, and nature's slow, merciless cruelty. It was used by various civilizations, Persians, Romans, native tribes, even during the European witch hunts, as a way to let the environment itself become the executioner. The condemned was stripped of clothing, dignity, and defense, then tied to a stake, tree, or nailed inside a wooden box left open to the world. Their body became an offering to the sun, the wind, and the swarming hunger of insects. Under the scorching sun, the skin blistered, cracked, and peeled, lips split, eyes burned, dehydration clawed at their throat, turning breath into a dry rasp of desperation. But that was only the beginning. Flies came first, crawling into the nose, ears, mouth, laying eggs in the softest, wettest places. Then ants, beetles, and biting gnats followed. They didn't just crawl, they burrowed into open wounds, under the skin, beneath fingernails. Maggots hatched in real time, feasting on the living. At night, freezing air gnawed at the body, once scorched by the day. Sleep was impossible. So was screaming. So was dying quickly. Exposure didn't kill with a strike. It killed by inches, letting the victim feel every stage of decay. Their body bloated, blistered, pulsed with movement beneath the flesh. Some went mad, chewing off their own tongue or scratching at their own eyes to end the torment. This punishment turned a person into prey, powerless, forgotten, consumed by the smallest, most relentless forces of the world. It was not death by man, but death by the earth itself, slow, watching, and completely without mercy. Sand burial. Sand burial was a punishment born from the cruel intimacy between earth and sun, an execution method that didn't require tools or flame, only time, heat, and the crushing weight of nature itself. Practiced in deserts across ancient and tribal regions, the condemned was led to a remote place where escape was impossible, and help was a fantasy. Stripped of dignity and hope, they were forced into a hole, buried up to their neck or chest in sand, then left alive. At first, it felt like restraint. The body couldn't move, arms trapped, legs pinned, but quickly the terror crept in. The sun beat down, the sand reflected the heat, skin burned, lips cracked, eyes swelled shut. Insects, drawn by the sweat, blood, or waste, crawled across the exposed face. Some burials were done near anthills or scorpion nests, allowing nature to exact its own rhythm of punishment. Bite by bite, sting by sting, dehydration set in. The tongue swelled, the throat shriveled. Every breath became more difficult as the chest fought against the pressure of encroaching sand, tightening like a fist. And worse, many weren't buried deep enough to die quickly. They were left as bait for the animals, or simply as a warning. Buzzards circled overhead. Some victims screamed until their voice collapsed into silence. Others sobbed, delirious, hallucinating, begging the earth to swallow them faster. Sand burial was not just physical torment. It was psychological erasure. There was no crowd, no executioner's face, just the sound of wind, the heat of the sun, and the slow, uncaring suffocation of the earth. A body sinking into silence. A life ending grain by grain. Witch's Iron Cage. The witch's iron cage was not simply an execution device. It was a sentence carved from fear, paranoia, and public spectacle. During the peak of the witch trials in Europe, women, often old, poor, or simply too outspoken, were accused of sorcery and heresy. Once condemned, many were stripped, shackled, and locked inside iron cages barely wide enough to contain a human body. These cages were not warm with fire, but cold, rusted prisons that held the accused like animals, twisting their limbs, forcing them to crouch, cramp, and contort. The cages hung from gallows or trees in public squares, exposed to rain, wind, sun, and the eyes of every passerby. There was no food, no water, no rest. The metal dug into flesh, the joints stiffened, and blood stopped flowing to fingers and toes. Victims couldn't sleep, couldn't stretch, could barely breathe. Birds pecked at their skin, insects nested in their hair, children threw stones, villagers pointed and spat. The accused was not just being punished, they were being erased publicly, piece by piece, as time gnawed them down to silence. Days passed, skin blistered and cracked, muscles seized, the body trembled under cold nights and blinding sun, and finally they died, not from a sword or fire, but from exposure, starvation, infection, and despair. The cage didn't kill with violence, it killed with neglect, slowly, mockingly. And even in death, their bodies weren't released. They hung there, lifeless and bent, as warnings, rotting proof that fear ruled over reason, and that no one was too old, too innocent, or too human to escape the iron grip of hysteria. Degloving of hands. Degloving of hands is a punishment so visceral, so primal in its cruelty, that it doesn't just destroy the body, it turns it inside out. It is the act of stripping the skin from the hand in a single brutal pull, like peeling a glove made of flesh, leaving behind raw, exposed tendons, gleaming bones, and nerves screaming with cold, white agony. This was not an accident of war or a medical tragedy. It was inflicted deliberately by torturers who understood the anatomy of suffering and used it like a scalpel. The victim's hand would first be restrained, often crushed, to weaken the connective tissue, the fingers yanked until the skin stretched, thinned, and split. Sometimes the hand was boiled briefly to loosen the dermal layers, or stabbed with small incisions along the base to sever anchors of skin. Then came the tearing, a slow, methodical rip from wrist to fingertips, skin sliding off like wet silk, but beneath it, everything remained horrifyingly alive. The hand, once a symbol of touch, of labor, of humanity, became an open wound, veins pulsing in the air, bones shimmering beneath blood, every twitch of the fingers a jolt of pain so intense it bordered on madness. Infection followed, fever, sometimes death, but often survival was the point, to leave the victim crippled, trembling, half-human, their hands now reminders of agony every time they reached for something they loved. Degloving wasn't just mutilation, it was transformation, a moment that rewrote the body in irreversible ways. It didn't ask for a confession. It didn't demand repentance. It simply left behind the truth that suffering, when engineered with precision, can peel a person apart, one layer at a time. The spider torture device. The spider was not a creature, but it behaved like one. This medieval instrument of horror was crafted from cold iron, shaped into cruel claws with curved, serrated points, and earned its name for how it clung to flesh and tore it away. It was used almost exclusively on women as punishment for adultery, heresy, or blasphemy, and it was designed not only to cause unbearable agony, but to erase what society believed made a woman feminine, powerful, or dangerous. The spider didn't just break bodies, it devoured them. The condemned was bound to a wall or post, stripped completely, trembling under the eyes of her executioners and the jeering public. The iron spider, sometimes red-hot, was pressed against her exposed breast. Then came the tearing. With one violent motion, the claws were yanked back, pulling skin, flesh, and sometimes the entire breast from the chest in a spray of blood and shredded tissue. The pain was beyond language. Screams turned to choking sobs. Blood poured in thick rivulets down her stomach, puddling beneath her feet. But the device wasn't always used just once. Some women endured multiple applications, each one more savage than the last. If the iron was heated, the flesh sizzled and fused to the metal before being ripped away, leaving the wound cauterized and burned, yet still raw and fatal. Death could come from shock, blood loss, or infection, but sometimes that wasn't the goal. Survivors lived disfigured, humiliated, and marked forever as warnings. The spider didn't just punish a woman, it erased her from the world she once belonged to. It was a tool of hatred and fear, a weapon that fed on the body with monstrous cruelty and left nothing behind but scars and silence. Shin Crushing. Shin Crushing was a punishment designed with clinical cruelty, targeting not the heart or the head, but the legs that carried a person through life. Used across medieval Europe, especially during confessions or interrogations, it was a method that didn't aim to kill, but to mutilate. The victim would be seated or tied down, their legs trapped between two solid boards or metal bars. Then came the wedges, thick, brutal, and unrelenting. Driven into the narrow space beside the shins with a hammer, each blow forced the wood deeper, compressing the bone until it split. The sound was unforgettable, a dull thud, then a sharp crack. The victim would scream, legs trembling until they couldn't tremble anymore. The tibia, the strongest bone in the body, would give way in jagged fractures, slicing muscle from the inside. Blood spilled from split skin, and still the wedges came, one after another. Some sessions involved 4 or more wedges driven in simultaneously, each strike calculated not for speed, but for agony. The nerves in the legs are dense. The pain was immediate, searing, and inescapable. Even after the torture ended, the aftermath was lifelong. Victims often lost the ability to walk, their legs bent or shattered beyond repair. Gangrene set in, bones healed, twisted. Every step for the rest of their lives became a reminder of the moment they were broken by design. Shin Crushing wasn't about answers, it was about control. It robbed people of movement, of power, of pride. It left them crawling, if they could crawl at all, a soul caged in a body that could no longer stand, not as a warning to others, but as a monument to pain that never truly ended. Feeding rotten food. Feeding rotten food as punishment wasn't about nourishment. It was about degradation, illness, and stripping a person of the last dignity left to them, the ability to choose what enters their body. used in prisons, gulags, slave camps, and torture chambers across history. This method blurred the line between cruelty and survival. The victim was presented with meals laced with decay, meat crawling with maggots, vegetables soaked in mold, water tainted with filth. It wasn't optional. They had to eat, and if they refused, they were beaten, starved, or force-fed until the stench of rot filled their lungs. The first bite was horror, the texture wrong, the taste unnatural, the mouth gagged involuntarily. But they were hungry, so hungry, and hunger has no pride. They swallowed. Then came the sickness, cramping, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. The body turned against itself in a violent, helpless purge. In some cases, the food was deliberately poisoned with spoiled milk, rancid oil, or excrement, designed to destroy not only the stomach, but the soul. And when they cried for clean water, they were given brine. When they begged for rest, they were taunted. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. It made people question their worth, their humanity, even their sanity. It forced them to live like animals, gnawing through filth to survive one more day. Feeding rotten food didn't require shackles or fire, just cruelty. It turned meals into weapons and hunger into humiliation. And for those who survived, the taste never left. It lingered in their gut, in their dreams, in the quiet moments when the memory of decay came flooding back, stronger than any pain. Family mutilation punishments. Family mutilation punishments were not aimed solely at the guilty. They were designed to crush the soul by targeting what we hold most sacred, our blood, our kin, our children. Practiced by tyrannical empires and brutal regimes, from ancient Assyria to Stalinist purges, this punishment used the family as a canvas for cruelty. If one member defied the state or disobeyed the crown, the punishment did not fall on them alone. It fell on those they loved. Fathers were forced to watch their sons blinded. Mothers were made to hear the screams of daughters as their tongues were torn out. Infants had fingers severed. Wives had their faces scarred. Husbands their limbs removed, not for what they did, but for who they belonged to. It was a torment deeper than torture, psychological mutilation wrapped in blood. The guilty would sometimes be spared death, left alive and broken, forced to live knowing they caused every scream, every scar, every drop of innocent blood. Some were made to perform the mutilation themselves, a blade in hand, trembling as they sliced the ears from their brother, as they burned their wife's flesh with hot irons. If they refused, the punishment doubled, tripled, until no love remained unscarred. This wasn't about law, it was about submission, control, destruction of loyalty to anyone but the ruler. It turned love into a weapon and blood into a curse. Afterward, families didn't embrace. They recoiled. Eyes wouldn't meet. The household became a grave of the living. Family mutilation didn't just silence rebellion. It buried it in guilt, in memory, in mutilated faces that never let you forget what your love once cost. Face branding. Face branding was a punishment meant to last forever, not through imprisonment or execution, but through permanent disfigurement carved into the most sacred canvas of identity, the human face. Practiced in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, colonial America, and even in slave societies, this was not just about pain. It was about marking a person as other, criminal, liar, slave, traitor, so the world would never forget, and the condemned could never escape. The process began with the forging of the brand, a searing hot iron rod shaped into letters or symbols, often representing the crime itself. A T for thief, H for heretic, S for slave. The condemned was bound, their head clamped, their body immobilized to prevent even a flinch. The heat radiated from the iron like a warning. Then, without ceremony, it was pressed to the cheek, the forehead, or just under the eye. The flesh hissed, skin bubbled, the smell of burning meat filled the air, and the scream that followed wasn't just pain, it was shame, ripping out of the lungs like a final breath of dignity. The pain didn't end when the iron lifted. It throbbed, it blistered, it festered. Days later, when the wound scabbed over and peeled, what remained was a scar that could never be hidden, not with time, not with makeup, not even with silence. Every face branding was a life sentence etched into skin, a declaration that this person was no longer whole, no longer anonymous, no longer allowed to walk among others without the world knowing what they had done or what had been done to them. It didn't just mark the face, it shattered it, turning identity into punishment and reflection into horror.